Hello everyone, welcome to the Story Tales, your place for the best horror stories. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I've been listening to horror stories for years, and now I'm here to share the most amazing ones with you. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It was a dull, gray afternoon when I first arrived in the small town of Black Hollow. The bus ride had been long and uneventful, with nothing but fields and patches of thick forest rolling by the window. By the time we pulled into the town's tiny station, the sky was heavy with clouds, and the air smelled of rain. I hoisted my backpack onto my shoulder and checked the crumpled note in my hand one last time. Ravenshade Guest House, 9 Crossroad. The streets were eerily quiet as I made my way to the address. The houses were old, their paint peeling and roofs sagging under the weight of time. When I finally stood in front of Ravenshade, it was everything I had expected, and yet something about it felt off. The building was large but worn, its dark wood exterior stained from years of weather. The windows, streaked with grime, seemed to watch me as I approached, and the sign above the door swayed slightly in the wind, its lettering faded, but still legible. I hesitated before knocking, my knuckles brushing against the cold, rough wood of the door. For a moment I thought about turning around, finding somewhere else to stay. But the rain had started to drizzle, and I was too tired to argue with my own unease. The door opened before I could knock. Mrs. Harper, the landlady, stood in the doorway, her small frame outlined by the dim light from inside. Her face was pale and drawn, with deep lines around her mouth and eyes that seemed to look straight through me. Her gray hair was tied back in a tight bun, and her clothes were simple, almost old-fashioned. "You must be the new guest," she said, her voice low and raspy. "Come in." I stepped inside, instantly struck by how cold it was. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the wooden floors creaked under my boots. The hallway was narrow, lined with faded wallpaper, and dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. Mrs. Harper didn't smile as she handed me a key attached to a brass tag that read "Attic Room." "It's the only room we have left," she said. "That's fine," I replied, trying to sound cheerful. "I don't mind attics." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not the attic you should worry about." I blinked. "What do you mean?" She sighed, her eyes darting to the staircase at the end of the hall. "That room has a history. People don't usually stay long." I laughed nervously, hoping to lighten the mood. "Well, I'm not superstitious. I'm sure I'll be fine." Mrs. Harper didn't laugh. She only stared at me for a moment, then turned away. "Suit yourself," she muttered, disappearing into what I assumed was the kitchen. I climbed the narrow staircase, the wood groaning under my weight with every step. The attic room was at the very top, its door slightly ajar as if it had been waiting for me. The room itself was small and sparse, with slanted ceilings that made it feel even smaller. There was an old iron bed pushed against one wall, a battered wardrobe against another, and a single window that barely let in any light. The floor was covered with a threadbare rug, and the only other piece of furniture was a wooden chair that looked like it had seen better days. Setting my backpack down, I took a closer look around. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing patches of cracked plaster beneath. A draft came through the window, which rattled slightly in its frame as the wind picked up outside. Still, it was just a room, old and worn, but nothing to be afraid of. I unpacked quickly, placing my clothes in the wardrobe, which groaned loudly every time I opened or closed it. The mirror on the inside of the wardrobe door was foggy, its surface speckled with black spots where the silver backing had worn away. By the time I finished, the rain outside had turned into a steady downpour. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sound of water dripping from the eaves and the occasional groan of the old house settling. That was when I first heard it. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the sound of the rain. A soft, rhythmic thudding, like footsteps. At first I thought it might be Mrs. Harper moving around downstairs, but the sound wasn't coming from below. It was coming from the hallway outside my door. I froze, my heart pounding. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, growing louder as they approached my room. "Mrs. Harper?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but there was no reply. After a few moments, I forced myself to stand up and open the door. The hallway was empty, stretching out into shadows at both ends. I shook my head, trying to laugh at myself. "Old houses make weird noises," I muttered, closing the door firmly behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard the footsteps again. This time they were accompanied by another sound, a faint, almost inaudible whispering. It was as if someone was speaking just outside my door, their voice too soft to make out the words. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, my eyes fixed on the door. The whispers grew louder, but when I summoned the courage to get up and check, the hallway was as empty as before. That night I barely slept. The whispers came and went, and the old house creaked and groaned as if it were alive. The next morning, over a sparse breakfast in the dimly lit kitchen, I asked Mrs. Harper about the noises. "Do you hear people walking around at night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. She didn't look up from her cup of tea. "The house is old," she said simply. "It makes noise, but it sounded like footsteps and whispering." Mrs. Harper's hands tightened around her cup. "The house doesn't like newcomers," she said after a long pause. "Sometimes it tests them." I frowned. "What does that mean?" She stood abruptly, clearing her plate. "You'll either get used to it or you won't," she said. "But don't go poking around where you don't belong. Some things are better left alone." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but I told myself she was just trying to scare me. Still, as the day went on, and the shadows in the house seemed to stretch and shift in strange ways, I couldn't shake the feeling that she might be right. That night, as the rain continued to pour and the wind howled outside, I braced myself for another restless night. Little did I know, the strange happenings were only just beginning. The rain didn't let up the next day, and the house seemed even darker than before. Clouds hung low in the sky, and what little light made it through the window felt cold and lifeless. I spent the morning trying to distract myself, reading an old book I'd found in the wardrobe, pacing the room, and listening to the storm outside. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't just the sounds at night or Mrs. Harper's cryptic warnings. It was the way the shadows seemed to linger in the corners of the room, darker and thicker than they should have been. It was the way the air felt heavy, like the house itself was breathing around me. By the time night fell, I was already on edge. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. That night, the footsteps returned. I had just turned off the lamp and settled into bed when I heard them again, slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway. My heart raced as I listened, every step echoing in my ears. This time, I didn't wait. I jumped out of bed and threw open the door. The hallway was empty. I stood there for a moment, staring into the darkness. The old wooden floor stretched out in both directions, the dim light from my room barely illuminating the walls. The footsteps had stopped, but the house felt alive, as if it were holding its breath. And then, I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just at the edge of the shadows, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its outline faint and blurry, like it was made of smoke. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, unable to move. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching me. I reached for the light switch, fumbling in the dark. When the bulb flickered to life, the figure was gone. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. For the rest of the night, I sat on the bed, clutching the flashlight I'd found in the wardrobe. Every creak and groan of the house made me jump, but the figure didn't return. The next morning, I went straight to Mrs. Harper. She was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. "I saw someone," I blurted out. She didn't look up. "You've been hearing things," she said calmly. "No," I insisted. "It wasn't just a sound. I saw someone in the hallway last night. A tall man, but he wasn't normal. He looked like smoke," she finished for me, her voice flat. I froze. "You've seen him too." Mrs. Harper finally turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "He's part of the house," she said. "He always has been." "Who is he?" I asked. She shook her head. "It's better if you don't know. The more you ask, the worse it gets." "That's not an answer," I snapped, frustration bubbling up inside me. "If something is happening in this house, I deserve to know." She stared at me for a long moment before sighing. "The house remembers," she said quietly. "It holds on to things, memories, people, pieces of the past. Sometimes they show themselves to the living." "That doesn't make sense," I said. "It doesn't have to," she replied. "But if you're smart, you'll leave. This place isn't safe." I wanted to argue, but her words left me speechless. As much as I hated to admit it, part of me knew she was right. But I didn't leave. That night I decided to stay up and watch. If the figure returned, I wanted to see it clearly, to prove to myself that it wasn't just my imagination. The hours dragged on as I sat in the chair by the window, the flashlight clutched in my hand. The storm had calmed, leaving the house eerily quiet. Every so often, I thought I heard faint whispers, but I told myself it was just the wind. It was around midnight when the shadows in the corner of the room began to move. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I watched, the darkness seemed to grow, stretching out across the floor like ink spilled on paper. I turned on the flashlight, aiming the beam at the corner. The shadows recoiled slightly, but they didn't disappear. Instead, they seemed to shift and twist, forming into the shape of a man. My hands shook as the figure stepped forward, its body still hazy and undefined. It didn't have a face, just a blank, featureless surface where eyes and a mouth should have been. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its presence heavy and suffocating. And then, slowly, it raised an arm, pointing toward the wardrobe. I stared at it, my mind racing. The wardrobe. Why? Before I could move, the figure dissolved, melting back into the shadows. I sat there for a long time, my heart pounding. The room was silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Finally, I worked up the courage to approach the wardrobe. My hands trembled as I opened the doors, the old hinges groaning loudly. Inside, everything was as I had left it. My clothes neatly folded on the shelves, the mirror still foggy and speckled. But as I moved my flashlight around, something caught my eye. In the back corner of the wardrobe, just barely visible, was a small locked box. I pulled it out, the wood cool and smooth under my fingers. The lock was old and rusted, but it didn't take much effort to break it open. Inside were photographs, black and white pictures of a family who must have lived in the house long ago. There was a man, a woman, and a little boy, all dressed in old-fashioned clothing. They looked happy, smiling at the camera, but as I flipped through the pictures, I noticed something strange. The boy's face was scratched out in every single photo. I shivered, the air in the room suddenly feeling colder. Who was this family? And why had the boy's face been erased? I wanted to take the photos to Mrs. Harper, but something told me she already knew about them. Instead, I tucked them back into the box and slid it under the bed. That night, I dreamed of the boy. He was standing at the foot of my bed, his face hidden in shadow. He didn't speak, but I could feel his anger, his sadness. When I woke up, the room was dark, and the whispers were back. Only this time, they were coming from inside the wardrobe. I sat frozen in my bed, the whispers growing louder. They were coming from the wardrobe, low, hurried voices, like dozens of people speaking at once. My hands trembled as I reached for the flashlight, its dim beam barely piercing the shadows that crowded the room. The whispers didn't stop. They circled me, pressing against my ears as if the voices wanted me to listen. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might drown them out, but it didn't. They only grew louder. I couldn't take it anymore. I leapt out of bed, crossing the room in 3 quick steps, and flung the wardrobe doors open. Nothing. The clothes hung limply, untouched. The mirror reflected my pale, frightened face, and the shelves were just as I had left them. But the whispers didn't stop. They were coming from beneath the wardrobe. Dropping to my knees, I aimed the flashlight under the wooden base and saw it, a narrow gap in the floorboards. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just a gap, it was a trap door. I hesitated. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run out of the house and never look back. But something else, something darker, pulled me in. I reached down and pried the trapdoor open. The hinges groaned, revealing a steep, narrow staircase leading into complete darkness. The cold air that rose from below smelled damp and rotten, like soil and mildew. I didn't want to go down there, but the whispers, those awful whispers, seemed to beckon me. Gripping the flashlight, I began to descend. The staircase was longer than it looked. The deeper I went, the colder it became, until I could see my breath fogging the air. The steps groaned under my weight, and every sound echoed like a scream in the dark. When I finally reached the bottom, I found myself in what looked like a hidden basement. The walls were rough stone, and the floor was covered in dirt and dust. Old furniture and broken crates were scattered around, their shapes casting strange shadows in the flashlight's beam. And then I saw them. The handprints. They were smeared across the walls and floor, small and childlike, pressed deep into the dirt. I staggered back, my stomach twisting. Some of the prints were faint, but others looked fresh, as if someone had just been there. "Hello?" My voice came out as a shaky whisper, barely louder than the voices that still echoed in my ears. Something moved in the corner of the room. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hands. For a moment, I thought I saw it, the shadowy figure, its arms reaching out. But when I stepped closer, it was gone. And then, I saw the box. It was sitting in the center of the room, just like the one I had found in the wardrobe. But this one was larger, its wood blackened and splintered. It looked ancient, like it had been buried for years. I stepped closer, my feet dragging through the dirt. My hands trembled as I reached out and opened the lid. Inside was a doll, dirty, cracked, and missing one eye. Its clothes were tattered, but it was unmistakable. It looked just like the boy in the photos. And then, the whispers stopped. The silence was worse. It pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I felt it before I saw it, the cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned slowly, and there he was. The boy. He stood just inches away, his face pale and hollow, his eyes empty. His clothes were ragged, and his skin was smeared with dirt, but it was his expression that terrified me the most. It was twisted with anger. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it echoed through the basement like thunder. I'm sorry," I stammered. The boy stepped closer. "She locked me away," he whispered. "She said I was wrong, that I was broken. I backed away, but he followed, his bare feet making no sound on the dirt floor. "They buried me," he said, "and they forgot me." "No," I said, shaking my head. "You're not real. You're just a story." The boy's eyes darkened. "I am real." The shadows around him began to move, twisting and writhing like smoke. The whispers returned, louder than before, and the flashlight flickered. "Please," I begged. "I don't want to hurt you." He smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "But I want to hurt you." The light went out. I screamed, stumbling backward, but the boy's voice was everywhere. "You can't leave," he said. "Not now, not ever." I ran. I don't remember how I made it out of the basement. The stairs felt endless, and the shadows clawed at my heels, but somehow I reached the attic. I slammed the trapdoor shut and shoved the wardrobe over it, my heart racing. The whispers didn't stop. I grabbed my bag and ran out of the room, down the creaking stairs, and into the hallway. Mrs. Harper was there, waiting for me. "You saw him," she said quietly. "What is he?" I demanded. Her face was pale. "He's what's left of my son." I froze. "Your son?" She nodded. "He wasn't normal. Things happened around him. Bad things. We tried to stop it, but the house..." Her voice broke. "The house wouldn't let him go." Tears filled her eyes. "We locked him away, but he wouldn't stay buried. And now he wants someone else to take his place." I didn't wait to hear more. I pushed past her out the door and into the cold night. The rain had stopped, but the house loomed behind me, dark and silent. I ran until my legs gave out. I never went back to Black Hollow. I never called Mrs. Harper, and I never looked up the history of the house. I didn't want to know. But the nightmares didn't stop. I still hear the whispers when I'm alone. I still see shadows move in the corners of my room. And sometimes, late at night, I feel a cold breath on the back of my neck, and I know he's still waiting. The letter arrived on a damp, gray morning, slipped under my apartment door like an unwelcome secret. I had been sitting cross-legged on the worn-out couch, half watching reruns of an old sitcom, spooning cold cereal from a chipped bowl. The soft scrape of paper against the wooden floor startled me. At first I thought it was another bill, a late payment notice maybe, but when I picked it up, my name stared back at me in dark, slanted ink. My full name, too, including the middle name I never used. Thomas Elijah Halloway. The envelope was old-fashioned, sealed with red wax stamped with an insignia I didn't recognize. A snake coiled around an eye. Its weight felt deliberate, as though the contents inside mattered more than any ordinary letter. I tore it open with jittery fingers and unfolded the yellowed parchment inside. "Mr. Halloway," it began, "we regret to inform you of the passing of your relative, Gregory Halloway, and extend our condolences. As the last surviving heir, you are hereby entitled to his estate, including Halloway House and its accompanying lands in Hollow Ridge. This inheritance is contingent upon your agreement to reside in the property for no less than 1 calendar year." I read the words 3 times before they sank in. I didn't have any living relatives, or so I thought. My parents had died when I was young, and I'd spent most of my life bouncing between foster homes. An uncle? No one had ever mentioned Gregory Halloway. And yet, there it was. A house, left to me, and all I had to do was live in it. I should have felt suspicious. If a stranger on the street had promised me a mansion, I would have laughed in their face. But staring at that letter, with its weight and formality, my skepticism melted away. Maybe it was desperation. My apartment lease was ending, and I was barely scraping by with part-time jobs. The idea of owning a house, a real house, felt like a lifeline. Within a week, I was driving through fog-draped hills, my trunk packed with suitcases and old memories I couldn't quite leave behind. Hollow Ridge was farther than I expected, tucked into a remote corner of the countryside. The roads grew narrower as I drove, the trees closing in like fingers clutching at the edges of the world. By the time I reached the property, dusk had begun to fall. The first thing I saw was the iron gate, twisted black bars curled like talons. It creaked as I pushed it open, and I hesitated before stepping through, as though the air itself thickened with warning. Then I saw the mansion. It loomed over the clearing, dark and jagged, its silhouette broken by towers and chimneys that reached like claws into the overcast sky. The stones were blackened with age, and ivy twisted up the walls, strangling the structure. A narrow path led to the entrance, lined with dead roses whose brittle petals scattered as I walked past. My footsteps faltered. The house felt alive in a way that houses shouldn't. Its windows glared down at me, and the door, massive and arched, reminded me of a gaping mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I forced myself to keep moving. After all, it was just a house. Old, creepy, and definitely in need of repair, but still a house. I turned the heavy brass knob and pushed. The door groaned open, and a wave of cold air swept out, carrying the scent of damp wood, mildew, and something faintly metallic. I shivered and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the chandelier, an enormous thing made of brass and crystal, hanging above the grand entry hall. Its light had long since died, leaving only shadows. The staircase spiraled upward, vanishing into darkness, and the walls were lined with portraits. The people in the paintings watched me. Their eyes were too sharp, too focused, as though they saw more than they should. I set my bags down and turned in a slow circle, taking in the details. Ornate mirrors hung between the paintings, their glass so polished that my reflection stood out, sharp and clear. The air felt heavier near them, and I found myself glancing away quickly. In the center of the hall stood a table covered in papers and dust. I brushed some of it aside and saw a ledger filled with dates and notes written in the same spidery handwriting as the letter. Beside it sat an old brass key. I picked it up, the metal cold against my palm. That was when the front door slammed shut behind me. The sound rang out like a gunshot, and my heart jumped. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but the hall was empty. I was alone. At least, I thought I was. Shaking off the unease, I began to explore. The rooms stretched endlessly, one leading into the next, each more decayed than the last. The wallpaper peeled and the ceiling sagged. Most of the furniture was draped in white sheets that billowed slightly as I passed, as though something underneath had shifted. Then I reached the library. It was cavernous, lined with shelves that rose high above my head, crammed with books so old their spines crumbled at the edges. A massive fireplace dominated the far wall, its hearth blackened with soot. Above it hung another mirror, this one taller than me, framed in carved wood that twisted into the shape of serpents devouring their own tails. I stepped closer, and my reflection stepped with me. For a moment, I swore it hesitated. I shook my head. "You're imagining things," I muttered, my voice sounding too loud in the silence, but the feeling stayed with me. That night, I slept fitfully in the dusty master bedroom, listening to the creaks and groans of the house. I told myself it was just settling. Old wood always made noises. The cold was normal. The mirrors weren't watching me. They couldn't be. Still, when I woke up the next morning, I found the mirror across from my bed uncovered, even though I distinctly remembered throwing a blanket over it before I went to sleep. And in the reflection, the bedroom door was cracked open, just enough to see a shadow move past it. Morning arrived reluctantly in Hollow Ridge, its light pale and hesitant, seeping through the thick curtains like a timid intruder. I lay in bed for a long time, staring at the mirror across the room. Its presence unnerved me. and the memory of the shadow slipping past the door refused to loosen its grip on my thoughts. Maybe it was a trick of the light, I told myself. Or maybe the stress of leaving everything behind for this strange, decrepit mansion was playing tricks on my mind. Either way, I needed to move. I swung my legs off the bed, wincing at the icy touch of the wooden floor. The house felt colder than it should have, as though the warmth of the sun hadn't touched it in decades. My breath fogged in the air as I pulled on a sweater and padded out into the hallway. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, the walls lined with portraits of the same piercing-eyed figures from the grand hall. In the daylight, or what little there was, their expressions looked almost softer, less accusatory. Almost. I stopped in front of a portrait of a man who bore a striking resemblance to me. His dark hair and sharp jawline mirrored my own, though his eyes were different. His gaze was colder, more calculating. The plaque beneath his portrait read, Gregory Halloway, 1842 to 1910. My stomach tightened. This was the man whose house I had inherited, the man whose shadow, in some inexplicable way, now loomed over my life. Why me? I murmured aloud, half expecting the painted figure to respond. Instead, the house answered. A soft creak echoed behind me, the kind of sound that only old wood could make when someone stepped on it. I turned sharply, my pulse quickening. The hallway was empty. I took a deep breath and shook my head. It's an old house, Tom. Old houses make noises, that's all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent the next few hours exploring the house in daylight, determined to familiarize myself with its sprawling layout. The mansion seemed designed to disorient. Corridors twisted in unexpected directions, doors led to rooms that shouldn't logically exist, and staircases spiraled into dimly lit alcoves. The library called to me again, its towering shelves filled with books I longed to touch but hesitated to disturb. The air there was thicker, heavier, as though centuries of secrets hung between the pages. I found myself drawn to the fireplace mirror. Unlike the others, its frame bore no dust, no tarnish. It gleamed as though polished regularly, though I couldn't imagine who would have done it. As I stared into its depths, a faint flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned quickly, scanning the room, but nothing was there. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection stared back, its expression identical to mine. But something felt off. I took a step closer, and my reflection did the same. I raised a hand, and so did it. Yet as I leaned in, studying the glass, I swore the eyes staring back at me weren't mine. They were darker, emptier, and filled with something I couldn't name. A sudden, sharp knock at the front door broke the spell. I stumbled back, heart racing. The sound echoed again as I made my way to the entrance hall, my steps cautious on the creaking floorboards. When I opened the heavy door, I found a man standing on the porch. He was tall and lean, his gray overcoat hanging loosely on his frame. A wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face, but his eyes gleamed sharply beneath it. "Mr. Halloway, I presume?" he said, his voice smooth but edged with something sharp. "Yes," I replied, gripping the door tighter. "And you are?" "Malcolm Drake," he said, offering a hand I didn't take. "I'm the solicitor handling your late uncle's estate." The name sparked recognition. It had been scrawled at the bottom of the letter I'd received. "I wasn't expecting anyone," I said, stepping aside reluctantly to let him in. "Apologies for the surprise visit," Drake said, brushing past me. "But there are matters we must discuss. Urgent matters." He moved through the house as though he'd been here before, his gaze sharp and assessing. When we reached the parlor, he gestured for me to sit. I did warily. "Mr. Halloway," he began, folding his hands neatly in his lap, "you've inherited more than a house. Halloway House is unique." "I've noticed," I said dryly, glancing around the room with its peeling wallpaper and cracked plaster. Drake's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. I don't mean its state of disrepair. This house has a history, one that stretches back centuries. Your family was no ordinary lineage. The Halloways were scholars, occultists, and custodians of certain artifacts. My brows knit together. Artifacts? He nodded. Objects of great power and danger, hidden here for safekeeping. Gregory Halloway was the last in a long line of guardians, and now, that responsibility falls to you. Wait, I said, holding up a hand. You're telling me my uncle was some kind of magical artifact collector? Drake's expression darkened. Not collector, protector. And whether you believe it or not, this house is more than just stone and wood. It is alive with the echoes of the past. There are things here that should not be disturbed. A chill ran down my spine. What kind of things? Drake hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the fireplace. You'll find out soon enough. For now, I must warn you. This inheritance is not without its dangers. There are forces that would kill to possess what lies within these walls. You must be vigilant. Vigilant, I repeated, my voice rising. I didn't sign up for this. I thought I was inheriting a house, not a war zone. Drake rose, adjusting his hat. Ignorance is no longer an option, Mr. Halloway. Whether you like it or not, this is your burden now. Before I could respond, he turned and strode toward the door. Wait, I called after him. What am I supposed to do? He paused at the threshold, his silhouette framed by the gray light outside. Survive, he said simply, and don't trust the mirrors. With that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the vast, silent house. The rest of the day passed in a blur of unease. I wandered aimlessly through the mansion, Drake's words echoing in my mind. By nightfall, the house seemed to shift around me, its corridors growing darker and colder. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, and faint whispers brushed against my ears. I retreated to the bedroom, closing the door firmly behind me. But as I climbed into bed, I noticed the mirror again, its surface catching the moonlight. This time, I didn't cover it. I stared into it, daring whatever secrets it held to reveal themselves. For a long time, nothing happened. The room remained silent, and my reflection stared back at me, unchanging. Then, as the clock struck midnight, the glass began to ripple. I froze, watching as the reflection distorted, shifting and twisting like water disturbed by a stone. A face emerged, not mine but something older and darker. Its eyes gleamed with malice, and its mouth twisted into a mocking smile. "Welcome home, Thomas," it said, its voice a guttural whisper that sent chills down my spine. The light in the room flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. The room was suffocating in its darkness, but it was the voice that gripped me. The voice from the mirror. Cold and hollow, it seemed to seep into my bones, freezing me in place. "Welcome home, Thomas," it repeated, its tone laced with mockery and malice. I couldn't move. My body felt weighted, as though invisible chains bound me to the floor. The reflection in the mirror wasn't mine anymore. It had my face, but the eyes, those cold, soulless eyes, weren't mine. The glass rippled again, distorting the figure's features until it was no longer human. The face elongated, the mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, and the shadows around it seemed to pulse with life. I forced myself to speak. "Who are you?" The figure's grin widened. "You already know." "No," I whispered, stepping back. "You're not real." The mirror rattled violently, and the voice grew sharper. "I am as real as the blood in your veins and the fear in your heart. You cannot run from me, Thomas. I am bound to you, just as you are bound to this house." I staggered back until my legs hit the edge of the bed. The mirror's glow dimmed, but the voice lingered, echoing inside my head. "This is only the beginning," it said. "You cannot escape your reflection." The glass went still. My reflection returned, but I no longer trusted it. The rest of the night passed in a haze of sleeplessness and dread. I couldn't close my eyes without seeing that twisted face staring back at me. The house, once merely unsettling, had become oppressive. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind seemed deliberate, as though the house itself was alive and watching. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay. I grabbed my phone and dialed Malcolm Drake's number, the only contact I had for someone who might understand what was happening. The line rang twice before he answered. "Mr. Halloway," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "I was expecting your call." "I need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "Something's wrong with this place. Wrong with the mirrors." There was a pause. "You've seen it." "You knew," I snapped. "You knew this would happen and you didn't warn me." "I warned you not to trust the mirrors," he replied coolly. "But you didn't listen." "What is it? What's happening to me?" "It's not just you," he said. "It's the house. It's tied to your bloodline, and so is the entity in the mirrors. It's a reflection of your family's past, centuries of secrets, bargains, and sins. You are its heir, and it will not let you go easily." I gripped the phone tighter. "Then how do I stop it?" Drake hesitated before answering. "You can't destroy it, but you can bind it." "How?" "There's a ritual, a sealing ritual that your uncle performed to keep the entity contained. The mirror in the library is the key. But be warned, Thomas. If you fail, it will claim you." The line went dead before I could ask more questions. I didn't waste time. Grabbing a flashlight, I made my way to the library, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The house seemed darker than before, even in daylight. Shadows pooled in the corners, and the walls felt closer, as though they were closing in. The mirror above the fireplace awaited me, its surface smooth and unbroken, but I could feel the wrongness emanating from it, the pulsing, malevolent energy that sent shivers down my spine. I searched the shelves until I found what I was looking for, a leather-bound journal with Gregory Halloway's name embossed on the cover. The pages were brittle, filled with strange symbols and cryptic instructions. I scanned them frantically until I found the ritual Drake had mentioned. It required a circle of salt, a candle, and blood. My blood. I gathered the materials quickly, my hands trembling. As I drew the circle around the mirror, the air grew heavier, charged with static. The shadows in the room thickened, pressing against the walls as if trying to break free. I lit the candle and sliced my palm, letting a few drops of blood fall onto the mirror's surface. It rippled, and the voice returned, louder this time. "You cannot bind me!" it roared, shaking the glass. I ignored it, focusing on the words written in the journal. The symbols blurred as the room spun, but I forced myself to keep reading. The mirror trembled violently, and cracks began to spread across its surface. "No!" the voice shrieked. "You belong to me!" I shouted the final words of the ritual, and the mirror shattered. For a moment, there was silence. Then the shadows in the room exploded outward, swirling around me like a storm. The candle flickered and died, and I was plunged into darkness. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The shadows pressed closer, but they couldn't cross the circle of salt. A low, guttural scream filled the room, as the shadows writhed and twisted, drawn back toward the broken mirror. Piece by piece they were sucked into the shards of glass, their screams fading, until only silence remained. I sank to the floor, my chest heaving. It was over. Or so I thought. The days that followed were quieter. The house no longer creaked with unseen footsteps, and the mirrors remained ordinary reflections. but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent hours cleaning the library and sealing off the broken mirror. The journal remained on the desk, its pages stained with my blood, a reminder of what had happened and what I'd barely survived. One afternoon, I returned to the portrait gallery and stopped in front of Gregory Halloway's portrait. His eyes seemed different now, less cold, more knowing. "I did what you couldn't," I whispered. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. My reflection in the glass of the portrait didn't move. My name is Eli, and I own an old shop called Timeless Treasures in the heart of Maplewood. It's not just a store filled with antiques. It's also my home. The building is 5 stories tall and more than 100 years old. On the first floor I run the shop, and the upper floors are where I live with my brother Jonah. We've had a few tenants over the years too. Our place creaks and groans like all old buildings do, but it has charm, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Jonah and I are pretty close. He's the practical one, always double-checking the locks and making sure the security cameras are working. I'm more laid back, except when things go wrong, which unfortunately happens a lot around here. Over the past few years, we've had a string of break-ins. Jonah called them bad luck streaks, but I think someone out there just wanted what we had. After the last burglary, we went all out. Steel-reinforced doors, motion sensors, extra cameras, the works. We thought we were safe. We were wrong. One chilly night in November, we were fast asleep. I was dreaming about some treasure hunt, while Jonah probably had spreadsheets in his dreams. He's the numbers guy. Suddenly, at 3 a.m., the phone rang, jarring us awake. It was our security company. "Mr. Eli, we detected movement downstairs." My heart skipped a beat. Jonah, already half-dressed, grabbed his flashlight. "It's probably a mouse or something," he muttered, trying to calm me down, but the way his jaw tightened told me he wasn't so sure. We hurried downstairs, still groggy. I was in pajamas, flip-flops barely hanging onto my feet, while Jonah had thrown on jeans and a hoodie. He looked ready for anything. I, on the other hand, looked ready for a nap. We split up to check the place. I went toward the front door while Jonah went toward the back. The front door was fine, no broken locks or smashed glass. For a second, I thought it really was just a false alarm. Then Jonah yelled, "Eli, someone's here!" I froze. My pulse thundered in my ears. I fumbled for my phone to call 911. My fingers felt like they belonged to someone else. The operator's voice was calm, but I was anything but. "There's someone inside," I whispered. The silence was broken by a crash that made my stomach drop. It sounded like shelves tipping over, glass shattering, and everything valuable being ripped apart. Jonah and I had no idea who or what was inside. He shouted from the back, "Stay on the line, I'm going in." I wanted to yell at him to wait, but Jonah never listens when he's made up his mind. He found the intruder first, a man in his late 30s, wearing a black hoodie and a ski mask. Later, we'd learn his name was Miles, but at that moment, he was just a shadow darting through the chaos. Miles and Jonah locked eyes. Miles tried to run, but Jonah wasn't about to let him get away. Miles dropped his backpack, probably thinking it would slow Jonah down, and bolted toward the restaurant next door, smashing through their glass door. Jonah didn't stop. He chased him out onto the street, and I followed, still clutching my phone. The street was quiet except for the sound of tires screeching. A dark car skidded to a stop a few feet away. A woman leaned out the window, her face pale and furious. "Get off him," she screamed. Later, we'd learn her name was Lila, Miles's partner. Lila revved the engine, and my heart jumped into my throat. She was aiming the car straight at Jonah. I screamed, waving my arms, trying to get her to stop. She didn't. At the last second, Jonah dove to the side, barely missing her bumper. Miles scrambled into the car, bleeding from the glass he'd smashed through. The car roared off into the night, leaving skid marks and a cloud of smoke behind. Jonah was on the ground, panting. "Are you okay?" I asked, helping him up. The police arrived minutes later, but by then, the duo was long gone. Jonah's shirt was smeared with Miles's blood, and the shop was a mess. We spent the rest of the night cleaning up, waiting for the detectives to arrive, and trying to process what had just happened. It took months, but the police finally caught Miles and Lila. Miles had been behind dozens of burglaries across the state. Lila had been his getaway driver every time. They didn't know we lived above the shop, which was their mistake. Looking back, it's terrifying to think about how close we came to disaster. Jonah still teases me about my flip-flops and how I yelled at the getaway car like it could hear me. But every time I pass that skid mark on the street, I remember how lucky we were that night. And if there's one thing I learned, it's this. Always know where your shoes are. Because when the shadows come alive, you need to be ready to run. My name is Elias. I'm not a kid anymore, but when I was little, I was terrified of the dark. Most kids are, right? But for me, it wasn't just the dark itself. It was what hid inside it. My parents always said it was normal, that I'd grow out of it. I'm not sure if they believed that, though. My dad, Gideon, didn't have much patience for me being scared. He was a big guy, the kind of person who walked into a room and seemed to take all the air with him. He worked construction and came home with dirt on his boots and a scowl on his face. Most nights he carried a beer in one hand and silence in the other. My mom, Clara, was the opposite. She was quiet and soft-spoken, with long hair that she always kept tied back. She was kind to me, but she was always tired. It wasn't the kind of tired you could fix with sleep. It was the kind that hung around like a heavy blanket. When I was 6, I got a little lamp shaped like a moon. It was supposed to help me sleep, but I guess my dad didn't like it. One night, when I was already in bed, he came in, yanked it out of the wall, and stomped it into pieces right there on the floor. I didn't say anything. My mom didn't either, though her face looked even sadder the next morning. That's when the whispers started. The first time I heard them, I thought it was my parents talking downstairs. It was late, and my room was pitch black because my lamp was gone. I remember staring at the ceiling, trying to focus on anything but the dark, when I realized the voices weren't coming from downstairs. They were coming from my room. They were soft, like people whispering secrets. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I knew they weren't my mom and dad. I pulled the blanket over my head and stayed as still as I could. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I told my mom about the whispers. She hugged me, but I could tell she didn't believe me. "Sometimes when it's really quiet, your mind plays tricks," she said. I didn't argue. I didn't tell her that the whispers felt too real to be my imagination. That night, my mom left the door open a little so the hallway light could come in. It helped, but not enough. The whispers came back. This time, they sounded closer, like they were moving around my room. I wanted to call for my mom, but my dad had just slammed their bedroom door, and I didn't want to make him mad. I stayed under my blanket and squeezed my eyes shut. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks again, but it didn't help. A few days later, something strange happened. I came home from school, and when I went to my room that night, I noticed something new. My ceiling was covered in tiny glowing dots. They looked like stars. I asked my mom about it, and she just smiled. "I thought it might help you sleep," she said. It did help. The stars weren't very bright, but they made the darkness seem smaller. I spent hours staring at them, watching them twinkle and shine. Sometimes it felt like they were moving, but I figured it was just my eyes playing tricks. The stars made me feel safe, even when the whispers came back. They were still there, but they didn't seem as scary anymore. I even started closing my door at night so my dad wouldn't slam it. I liked it better that way. But then, one night, everything changed. It was late, and I was already in bed when I heard the front door slam. My dad's voice boomed through the house, louder than usual. My mom was trying to calm him down, but he wasn't listening. His footsteps were heavy, and I could hear them coming up the stairs. I stared at the stars on my ceiling, trying to ignore the noise. Then my mom's footsteps followed. She was running. There was a loud thud, like something heavy falling to the floor. My mom gasped, and then everything went quiet. I don't know why I got out of bed. Maybe I thought I could help. Maybe I just wanted to make sure my mom was okay. I opened my door and stepped into the hallway. The light was still on, but it felt dimmer somehow. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw my dad. He had my mom's hair clenched in his fist, and she was on the floor trying to pull away. I didn't think. I just ran up to him and hit him as hard as I could. He didn't even flinch. My dad grabbed me by the arm and lifted me off the ground like I weighed nothing. He laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. "Big brave man, huh?" he slurred. Then he threw me back into my room. I hit the floor hard, and before I could get up, he was standing over me. He leaned down so close I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "You ever touch me again, and you're dead," he said. Then he shoved my head into the floor and left, slamming the door behind him. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just laid there, staring up at the stars. They looked different now, brighter somehow. The darkness around them seemed to swirl, like it was alive. Then I heard it. A voice, but not a whisper this time. It was deep and strong, and it felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. It said one word: stay. The stars above me started to move, swirling faster and faster until they formed shapes. It looked like hands reaching out of the ceiling. I was too scared to scream. The door to my room creaked open, and I saw my dad standing there. His face was red with anger, but when he looked up at the ceiling, he froze. His eyes widened, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear on his face. The hands reached down, grabbing him by the arms and lifting him off the ground. He screamed, but it didn't last long. The darkness swallowed him whole, and then he was gone. My mom found me the next morning, still lying on the floor. She hugged me tight and told me everything was going to be okay. We moved out of the house a few days later, and my dad never came back. Years later, I asked my mom about that night. She told me she didn't know what happened, but she believed something was protecting us. She said she felt safe for the first time in years. I don't know what those stars were or where they came from, but I'll never forget them. They weren't just stars, they were something more, something powerful, something that saved us. And sometimes, when the night is quiet and the sky is clear, I look up at the real stars and wonder if they're still watching over me. Hi kids, my name is Elijah, and I'm going to tell you a story about something that happened to me when I was about your age. It's not a happy story, but it taught me to be brave. So, tuck yourselves in, and let me begin. When I was 12 years old, my family and I went on a sailing trip on Lake Crescent in Washington. My dad, Joseph, loved sailing. He grew up near the coast, so he always said the water was where he felt most at peace. Mom, Sarah, was a painter, and she would bring her sketch pad everywhere we went, drawing all the beautiful places we visited. My little sister Violet was only 8 at the time. She was the curious one, always asking questions and poking at things she probably shouldn't. The trip was Dad's idea. He'd rented a small sailboat called the Wanderer, and we were going to spend the day exploring the lake. The weather was calm when we started, and Violet kept pointing out ducks and dragonflies while Mom sketched the mountains in the distance. Everything felt perfect. Dad let me steer the boat for a while. "You've got steady hands, Eli," he said with a proud smile. I remember feeling so grown up at that moment, holding the wheel and guiding us over the rippling water. But then, things changed. It started with a breeze. Nothing scary at first, just a cool wind that made the sails flap loudly. "Looks like a storm's coming," Dad said, glancing at the sky. Dark clouds were creeping over the mountains, swallowing the sunlight. "Should we head back?" Mom asked, her voice tense. "Yeah, let's turn around," Dad said. but his calmness didn't fool me. His hands gripped the wheel tighter as he took over. Before we could make much progress, the wind picked up. The once gentle breeze turned into a howling force, and waves began to toss the boat like a toy in a bathtub. Violet clung to Mom, her eyes wide with fear. I tried to help Dad, but the wheel wouldn't budge. It felt like the lake itself was fighting us. And then, the water started coming in. "Eli, grab the bucket under the seat," Dad shouted. My heart pounded as I scrambled to find it. By the time I started scooping water out, it was already pooling around our feet. "We're sinking," Violet screamed. "No, we're not," Mom said, trying to stay calm, but I could see the panic in her eyes. Then the boat tipped. I don't remember the exact moment we hit the water. One second I was clutching the bucket. The next, I was floating in the icy lake, gasping for air. Mom and Violet were nearby, both of them shouting. Dad was yelling something, but the wind drowned out his words. "Stay together!" he finally screamed. The life jackets kept us afloat, but the waves were so high that it felt like we were being swallowed. I clung to Violet, and Mom held on to me. Dad was a few feet away, but the waves kept pushing him farther. "Swim for shore!" he yelled. "It's the only way!" The shoreline was just a dark line in the distance, barely visible through the rain. "We can't make it," Violet cried, her small arms clinging to my neck. "Yes, we can," Mom said firmly. "We just have to keep moving." We started swimming. The cold water made my limbs feel heavy, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Every time I looked back, Dad was farther away. After what felt like hours, the sky grew darker, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. My arms and legs burned with exhaustion, but I forced myself to keep going. I didn't want to let Violet down. Then I heard Mom gasp. "Elijah!" she shouted. I turned around and saw Dad. He wasn't swimming anymore. My stomach twisted as I watched him sink beneath the waves. Mom screamed, but we couldn't go back. We had to keep going. "Don't look back," she told me. I don't know how long we swam after that. Time felt strange, like it stretched on forever but also sped past in a blur. Violet was quiet now, her head resting on my shoulder. Then I felt it, the soft, squishy ground beneath my feet. "Mom, I can touch the bottom," I shouted. We had reached the mud flats, but it wasn't over. The mud was thick and sticky, pulling at my legs with every step. Mom stayed behind me, pushing Violet forward when she got stuck. "You're doing great, Eli," she said, though her voice was shaky. Finally, we reached the shore. I collapsed onto the sand, holding Violet close as Mom sat beside us. But something was wrong. "Where's Dad?" Violet asked, her voice small. Mom didn't answer. She just hugged us tighter. The next morning, rescuers found Dad's body. I didn't understand it then. I thought he was the strongest person in the world. How could he be gone? For a long time, I blamed myself. I thought if I had just been stronger, faster, braver, maybe I could have saved him. But I've learned that some things are out of our control. Now, I don't let my fear stop me. I've even gone back to the water. It took years of practice, but I've learned that the best way to honor Dad is to keep moving forward, just like he told us to that night. And whenever I'm scared, I think of him smiling at me and saying, "You've got steady hands, Eli." The day my family moved into the old house at the edge of the woods, I wasn't too excited. To be honest, I didn't even care much about where we were going, as long as I had my own room and a space to play. The boxes and the packing were the only things on my mind, and I was mostly focused on making sure my comic books, toys, and video games didn't get lost in the shuffle. Mom had been talking non-stop about how perfect this house was. It was big, way bigger than our last house, and had a massive yard. Dad was excited because there was a big garage for his tools and projects, and my younger brother, Max, loved the idea of having more space to run around and explore. He was the one who spent the most time jumping from room to room, as if the whole place was an adventure. But to me, the house was just old. It creaked every time you stepped on the floorboards, and the wooden walls had a smell, like something that had been forgotten in time. It was a strange feeling, like the house had been waiting for us to show up, but also like it didn't want us there. I couldn't shake the odd sensation that the house itself was watching us. I didn't tell Mom or Dad about that feeling. I didn't want to sound silly. Instead, I focused on helping them unpack and get settled in. Max was the one who spent most of his time in the attic, claiming it was his secret hideout. He said he loved the attic because it felt spooky and full of mystery, but I didn't feel the same way at all. I figured it was just an attic, a place to store boxes, nothing special. The first night in the house felt fine at first. Mom cooked a big dinner in the kitchen, and we all sat around the table, talking about how we were going to make the house our new home. I ate my food quietly, looking around at the old wooden beams on the ceiling and the windows that rattled a little when the wind picked up. Later, after dinner, we started unpacking. I set up my room, carefully placing my comics on the shelf and hanging up my posters. Max was running around, playing with his toy trucks, so I didn't pay much attention to him. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards under our feet. When we all went to bed that night, I thought everything would be normal. But when I lay in bed in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I heard something. It wasn't loud, but it was definitely there. A soft thump, like something had fallen over in the attic. It wasn't unusual for houses like this to make noises. Settling, they call it. But this noise didn't feel like settling. It felt deliberate, like someone was walking around up there. At first, I thought it was just the house being old. But as the night went on, I started hearing more. Soft, quiet shuffling noises coming from the ceiling. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was probably just an animal in the attic. Maybe a squirrel or a raccoon had found its way in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I turned over in bed, pulling the covers tighter around me, trying to drown out the sound. But then, as I was about to fall asleep, I heard something else. A faint tapping. It was rhythmic, like someone knocking on the walls. It was coming from the hallway outside my room. My heart started to race. I froze in bed, straining my ears to listen. The tapping stopped, but the air felt thick, like something was moving just out of sight. I didn't want to get up and look. I just lay there, trying not to breathe too loudly, hoping it was just the house settling again. But the tapping didn't stop. It was so soft, but it was there. It was like tiny, delicate fingers tapping against the walls. "Max?" I whispered, unsure if he was awake. He was always a light sleeper, but I didn't want to disturb him if he was already asleep. There was no answer. I listened again, but this time the tapping was joined by something else. A low, muffled whisper. At first it was so faint I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. It wasn't just one voice. It sounded like several voices, all talking at once in a language I couldn't understand. I pulled the blankets over my head, clutching my pillow tightly. The sound of the voices seemed to swirl around the room, like they were coming from all directions. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it would wake the whole house. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't even think straight. All I knew was that I was scared. I was sure I wasn't hearing things. There was someone, outside my room. But who? And why were they whispering? After what felt like hours, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It was thick and heavy, like something was waiting for me to make a move. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined something crawling across the floor, something hiding in the shadows. The tapping came back in waves, each time sounding closer. I pulled the covers up to my chin, trying to block out the noise. When morning finally came, I was exhausted. I couldn't shake the images of those voices from my mind. I told myself it was just the house. Maybe it was the old pipes, or maybe there were rats in the walls. I didn't want to believe it was something more. After breakfast, I went outside to get some fresh air. Max was already out in the yard, playing with his toy trucks. I sat on the porch for a while, watching him. The woods beyond the house were silent, but the air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. Max came up to me after a while, holding his toy truck in his hands. "I heard something last night," he said quietly. I looked at him, trying not to show how nervous I was. "What do you mean?" "I heard tapping, like someone was knocking on the walls," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I felt my stomach tighten. I hadn't told anyone about what I heard, but Max had heard it too. "It was probably just the house," I said, trying to sound calm. "It makes noises, you know. Old houses do that." Max shook his head. "No. This was different. It was like something was in the walls, walking around." I didn't say anything. There was nothing else to say. I just nodded, hoping that Max would forget about it. But deep down, I knew that whatever it was wasn't going to go away. It was in the house, and whatever was in there, whatever was whispering and tapping, was not something we could ignore. Later that day, I decided to explore the attic. I told myself it was because I needed to make sure there were no animals up there, but in reality, I was trying to figure out what was causing the noises. The idea of crawling into that dark, narrow space gave me chills, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. The attic was even worse than I remembered. It smelled musty, and the air felt thick with dust. I grabbed a flashlight and began walking around, shining the light into every corner. The beam of light flickered as I moved it around, and the shadows seemed to shift as if they were alive. When I reached the far corner, I saw it. The wall, the one that had always seemed off. At first, it looked like just a regular wall, but when I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. The wood seemed out of place. There were bumps along the surface, like something had been pushed behind it. I leaned in closer, pressing my ear against the wall. For a moment, everything was quiet. But then I heard it. A soft, muffled sound, like a whisper. I stepped back, my heart racing. I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. It wasn't coming from the floor or the ceiling, just the wall. It felt like it was coming from inside the wood itself. I shone the flashlight around the room, looking for anything that could explain the strange noises. But there was nothing. Just dust and forgotten objects that had been left behind. That's when I noticed it. The faint outline of something in the wall. It was hard to make out at first, but as I looked closer, I realized it was the shape of a door. A hidden door, tucked away behind the wood. I didn't know why, but I had to open it. I grabbed the edge of the wood and started pulling, my hands trembling. The door creaked as it shifted, and a cloud of dust filled the air. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest as I pulled the door open wider, revealing a narrow passageway behind it. The darkness beyond seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. Before I could step inside, I heard something, a shuffle, a soft sound, like someone moving behind me. I froze, holding my breath. The sound stopped, but I knew I wasn't alone. I stood there, frozen in the dim attic, the flashlight trembling in my hands. My heart raced, and the air felt heavier, as if it were thickening around me. The soft shuffle behind me had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was there, hidden in the shadows. The passage in front of me seemed to beckon, its dark mouth opening wider with every second I hesitated. The wooden door I'd just pulled open now stood like a secret, and I couldn't tell if it was something I was supposed to find, or something I was never meant to discover. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat, hoping to see nothing but the empty attic. But the silence felt suffocating. The moment I looked over my shoulder, I felt a cold draft brush against my neck. It wasn't the breeze of an open window. No, this felt different. It was unnatural. I swung the flashlight around, the beam slicing through the darkness, but the attic was still empty. No one stood there. No ghostly figure, no shadow lurking in the corner, just piles of old boxes and forgotten furniture. I was being paranoid. I knew it. My mind had already wandered too far into the unknown, letting my imagination run wild. But the feeling remained, that gnawing sense that something was off, that I had just uncovered something I shouldn't have. Steeling myself, I turned back to the passage, the narrow opening just large enough for me to squeeze through. The walls of the attic were closing in on me now, the familiar clutter of forgotten objects suddenly feeling menacing. I had to know what was behind that door. I had to know what was in the walls of this house. With a deep breath, I stepped into the passage. The darkness swallowed me instantly. I was plunged into near complete blackness, the only light coming from my shaking flashlight. I moved forward cautiously, every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet sounding louder than before. The passage was tight, the air growing colder as I moved further inside. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, that the walls themselves were breathing. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Each time it blinked out for a split second, I felt like something might be moving just beyond the reach of the light. I gripped the flashlight tighter, praying it wouldn't fail on me. After what felt like an eternity of slow steps, I finally reached the end of the passage. There, set into the far wall, was another door. It looked almost exactly like the one in the attic. A wooden weathered door, aged with time. The wood around the doorframe had deep grooves, and the paint had long since chipped away, leaving behind a dull, grayish surface. I wasn't sure what I expected to find behind it, but it certainly wasn't what I saw when I pushed the door open. Behind the door was a small, dark room, barely large enough to stand in. The walls were lined with shelves that were filled with old books and strange artifacts, things I couldn't recognize, like small glass bottles filled with dark liquid, bundles of dried herbs, and odd tools that looked like they had been left here decades ago. It was as though I had discovered a hidden corner of history, untouched by time. But what caught my eye more than anything was the large wooden chest sitting in the center of the room. It was ancient, its surface scarred by time and wear, but it was still intact. The chest was bound with rusty iron, and its latch appeared to be held shut with a lock that seemed strangely out of place for such an old chest. I stepped inside the room, the air growing colder still. I felt an overwhelming sense of curiosity, mixed with something else, something darker. There was an energy here, something oppressive, as though the room itself was waiting for me. The chest stood like a sentinel in the center of it all, daring me to open it, daring me to discover what it held. I approached the chest cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I knew I should leave it alone. I knew I should just go back to the attic, forget this entire room ever existed. But I couldn't. I couldn't resist the pull of the mystery. I knelt in front of the chest and inspected the lock. It was an old-fashioned thing, worn with age but still solid. It didn't look like it had been touched in years, perhaps even longer. Yet there was something about the lock that seemed familiar. It was as if I had seen it before, in a dream or a memory that I couldn't quite place. I tried the latch, tugging on it gently at first, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was stubborn, resisting my attempts. The more I pulled, the more frustrated I became, but something inside me refused to give up. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I had to open it, like whatever was inside had been waiting for me. Then, in the dim light of my flashlight, I noticed something strange. A small carving on the lock. A symbol. It was faint, as though it had been scratched there a long time ago. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. The symbol was intricate, swirling lines that seemed to form a strange pattern. I had no idea what it meant, but something about it felt important, as though the symbol itself held the key to unlocking the chest. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small penknife I had kept with me for years. The blade wasn't sharp, but I used it to carefully pry at the lock, hoping to dislodge it. My hands were shaking, but I didn't stop. Something inside me was driving me, and I couldn't back away now. With a sharp click, the lock gave way. It fell open with a soft, hollow sound, and I took a deep breath. My heart pounded in my chest as I lifted the lid of the chest. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was an earthy, musty scent, like old books and damp wood. I winced at the smell, but forced myself to look inside. What I saw sent a chill through my entire body. The chest was filled with old, yellowed papers, parchment-like sheets stacked on top of each other. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the papers. They looked ancient, brittle, like they might crumble to dust if I touched them wrong. But beneath the papers, nestled at the very bottom of the chest, was something else. Something that gleamed faintly in the light of my flashlight. I reached in carefully, pulling out the object. It was a small, intricately carved box, much smaller than I had expected. The box was made of wood, but its surface was covered in strange symbols, much like the one on the lock. The symbols were worn, but still legible. They seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, as if they were alive, waiting for someone to understand their meaning. I turned the box over in my hands, feeling the weight of it. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong here, in my hands, in this world. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized I had just uncovered something I wasn't supposed to find, something that had been hidden away for a reason. I turned to leave the room, but as I did, I heard it again, the shuffle. This time it was louder, closer, as if someone, or something, was moving just behind me. I whipped around, but the room was empty. The chest was still open, the box still in my hands. But the feeling of being watched, of being followed, was undeniable. I had to leave. Now. With one last look at the dark room, I shoved the box into my jacket pocket and made my way back down the passage, the light of my flashlight now seeming weaker than ever. The darkness felt suffocating, and every step I took sounded like a hammer striking stone. When I reached the attic again, I quickly closed the door behind me, sealing off the passage. My breath was ragged, and my heart pounded in my chest. I was in a panic, but I didn't know why. Nothing had happened. Nothing visible, nothing tangible. But that box, it felt important. It felt like it had a purpose, something far beyond what I understood. I had to find out more. But I was scared, and I wasn't sure who or what was watching me from the shadows. I stood in the attic, the flashlight trembling in my hand, casting a feeble circle of light across the cluttered space. The box was still nestled in the inside pocket of my jacket, its weight pressing against my chest like a constant reminder of the secret it held. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The house had changed. Or maybe it was just me. The attic seemed smaller now, as though the walls had inched closer, tightening like a vice around me. The strange shuffle I'd heard earlier still echoed in my mind, each faint scrape of a shoe or whisper of movement sending jolts of terror through my body. But I couldn't run away. Not now. I needed to understand what the box meant. I needed to know why I had been drawn to it, why it felt like my entire existence had been leading me to this moment. But more than that, I had to find out what had been hidden in this house for so long, what force or entity had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right person to uncover the truth. I tried to steady my breath, but the anxiety swirling in my chest was relentless. My fingers ached as I reached into my jacket and pulled out the box. It was heavier now, as though it had grown more substantial in the time I'd spent holding it, like a living thing pressing against my palm. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. They twisted and shifted in the dim light of the attic, moving like they were alive, breathing. I almost dropped the box in shock, but I held it steady, afraid to look away. The feeling of being watched intensified, and my pulse quickened in my throat. There was no turning back now. I flipped the box over, inspecting its surface for any sign of how to open it. At first, I saw nothing, just the same intricate symbols, the same spirals and lines that seemed to mock me. But then I noticed something strange, a faint crack running down one side of the box, barely visible at first, as though it had been sealed shut for centuries. Without thinking, I ran my fingers along the crack, feeling it deepen beneath my touch. It was as though the box had been waiting for me to unlock it, to open it once and for all. My heart pounded in my chest, and the air in the attic seemed to thicken with each passing second. I pushed against the crack with my thumb, and to my surprise, the lid of the box slowly began to lift. The air around me crackled, charged with an electric tension, as though the very fabric of reality had been stretched to its limit. And then, the lid was open. Inside the box was a small piece of paper, yellowed with age, its edges frayed and brittle. I hesitated before touching it. It felt like the paper itself might disintegrate under my fingers. But I had no choice. I had to know what was written on it. I carefully lifted it out, unfolding it with a trembling hand. The writing was old. The ink faded in places, but the words were unmistakable. This house is the key. The door has been sealed, but it will open for the one who knows the truth. The veil between worlds is thin here. You must choose. Close it or cross through. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at the paper, trying to comprehend its meaning, but it made no sense. The veil between worlds. What was that supposed to mean? Close it or cross through? Cross through where? What was on the other side? Suddenly, the temperature in the attic dropped sharply. My breath clouded in the cold air, and I heard it again, the shuffle. But this time, it wasn't just a sound. It was a presence. Something, someone, was standing behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But no one was there. I was alone. Yet the air around me felt charged. There was an oppressive weight in the space, an energy that pulsed and pressed against me, as though the house itself was alive. My heart raced as I turned back to the paper, desperately trying to make sense of it. That's when I saw it, something moving in the corner of my vision. A shadow, a figure, tall and indistinct, emerging from the darkness in the farthest corner of the attic. It was shrouded in the same oppressive fog that had enveloped the space, its form wavering like a mirage. I could barely breathe. My body froze, paralyzed by fear. I wanted to run, to escape, but my feet wouldn't move. And then, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have opened it." The voice was deep and haunting, a whisper that seemed to come from all directions. "Now, you've made your choice." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who are you?" My voice cracked, barely audible in the thick silence. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming clearer, though still barely distinguishable. It was tall, draped in shadow, with no discernible face, just a shifting, swirling mass of darkness that seemed to consume everything around it. "I am what remains," the voice answered, its tone distant, as though it were speaking from another realm. "The price of the truth is high. The veil between the worlds can only be maintained for so long. Now, you must choose." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me, suffocating, as though the very air had thickened with the weight of what I had just uncovered. The figure moved again, closing the distance between us with unnerving speed, its presence overwhelming, oppressive. "You can close the door," it whispered. "Erase the truth. Forget what you've seen. Walk away, and all of this will remain buried. The house will forget, and so will you." The words reverberated in my mind. Part of me, most of me, wanted to turn away, to forget this moment, to bury it deep down and never speak of it again. But another part of me, the part that had been drawn to this house, to the attic, to the box, knew there was no turning back. I wasn't afraid of the truth. I had to know. Or, the figure continued, its voice now a low growl, you can cross through. Cross through what? I asked, my voice shaky but determined. The figure's shadowy form flickered, its presence growing even more intense. You'll see. With a final eerie glance, the figure seemed to dissipate, melting into the surrounding darkness as if it had never existed at all. I was alone once more. For a moment, I stood there, frozen in place, the paper still clutched tightly in my hand. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air, pressing down on me like a physical force. I looked at the box again, at the strange symbols, the paper, the words. I could close it. I could forget all of this, forget the truth that had been unearthed, and leave this place behind. I could walk away, back to my normal life, and pretend none of this ever happened. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't work. The house had already marked me. I had already crossed the threshold. There was no going back. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and made my choice. With trembling hands, I reached for the box, pressing my palm against the cold wood, and felt the energy surge around me. The attic around me began to warp, the walls distorting, stretching like they were being pulled apart by an unseen force. And then, the door opened. Not the attic door. The door between worlds. I stepped forward, and as I crossed the threshold, the world around me shattered, folding into itself like a book closing. The air was filled with a low hum, the very fabric of reality twisting and folding in on itself. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the house, standing silent and still in the distance. A place that had once been home, but was now something else entirely. The truth had been unveiled, and there was no turning back. It was a cold, gloomy afternoon when I made the discovery that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The kind of day that makes your skin crawl, with gray clouds hanging low over the city. My house, an old Victorian-style building with creaky wooden floors and high ceilings, always felt a bit eerie during such days. Maybe it was just the age of the house, or perhaps it was something deeper, but the feeling of being watched never quite left me. Still, I loved it. It was my home, the place where I could be alone, away from the chaos of the world. I was in the middle of some renovations, nothing too dramatic, just fixing up the old hallway. The walls had cracks, and the plaster was falling apart in places. I had a crowbar in my hand, determined to tear down the drywall to expose the wooden studs behind. I thought I'd uncover some old wiring, maybe a leak that had been patched up over the years. The usual mess that came with home repairs. Nothing to worry about. But as I swung the crowbar into the wall, I hit something solid. At first, I thought it was just a wooden support beam, but the sound it made was wrong. Too smooth. I pulled back and tried again, but this time, I aimed carefully at the spot. The crowbar went deeper than expected, and a large chunk of drywall fell away, revealing something that took my breath away. A wooden frame. A window frame. My stomach twisted, the uneasy feeling I had been trying to ignore all afternoon suddenly blossoming into full-blown panic. There was no window here. No way. My heart raced as I stepped back and examined what I had just uncovered. The window, covered in dust and grime, was old. Very old. The glass was cloudy, thick with age, and the frame was worn down, like something left untouched for decades. But the strangest part? There was no corresponding window on the outside of the house. I rushed to the window in my living room, then to the outside of the house, flashlight in hand. I stood there, shining the light on the side of the building. Just a flat wall painted gray, with no signs of any windows. No bump in the structure to suggest anything was hidden behind the wall. My pulse quickened as I returned inside, my mind racing. How could there be a window with no exterior counterpart? How could this be? I stood there in the hallway, staring at it in disbelief. This shouldn't be possible. The thought was too bizarre, too impossible to ignore. There was no reason for it. I wiped my sweaty palms on my jeans, my eyes flicking from the frame to the empty hallway around me. No other clues, no signs that something unusual was happening. But I knew what I had just uncovered was real. It wasn't a dream. This wasn't some kind of joke. My hands trembled as I wiped the glass with my shirt sleeve, just to confirm that it wasn't an illusion. The reflection that met my eyes was weak at first, just a blur. But then something caught my attention. A faint glow. On the other side of the glass. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging up the window, and the faint glow became clearer. A dim light seemed to spill from somewhere beyond the glass. My eyes widened, heart hammering in my chest as I peered through. What I saw on the other side didn't make sense. A room, a small room. It was barely visible at first, but the more I stared, the more it became clear. It was a bedroom. The bed was narrow, covered with a plain comforter, and a small side table sat beside it. On the far wall was a dresser, simple, with a few objects on top, though they were too far to make out. The strangest thing was the lamp, glowing softly. It wasn't flickering, it wasn't dead, it was just there. A steady, unearthly glow that seemed to pulse with some kind of eerie life. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming faster. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the room, but I had to. I had to think, to understand what was happening. My mind was racing. This wasn't possible. There was no room there, no door, no entrance, just a solid wall on the outside. I started pacing, my thoughts jumbling. Was this some sort of prank? Maybe a hidden camera, some kind of trick? But it didn't feel like a joke. It felt far too real, too unsettling. I pulled my phone from my pocket, flicked through my old house blueprints, which I kept tucked away in a drawer. My hands were shaking as I scanned the old paper. I knew the layout of the house by heart, but I needed to be sure. I needed something logical to explain this impossible situation. But the blueprint showed nothing. Nothing that could explain the window. The hallway had always been straight, with no rooms in that spot. It was just a hallway, leading into the living room and kitchen. Nothing about an extra room, no hidden passageways, nothing. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up, the weight of the mystery pressing in on me. I rubbed my face with my hands, trying to calm myself, but the unease kept growing. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the small room behind the glass, the way the lamp illuminated the dusty air, the shape of the bed, the feeling that someone, or something, was in there. I tossed and turned, heart pounding, unable to shake the image of the room from my mind. I wanted to tear the house apart, to find some way inside, to know what lay beyond that window. But at the same time, a part of me was terrified to do so. I didn't know what I might find. The next morning, my curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't stay away any longer. I needed to investigate further, but I also needed to be careful. My mind was racing with 1,000 different theories, none of them making sense. I returned to the hallway, hammer in hand, ready to break through more of the drywall. I took a deep breath and swung the hammer, carefully striking the area around the window. I worked quickly, but with precision. I had to be careful not to shatter the glass. After several moments of cautious effort, the frame was exposed, and I ran my hands over the edges, feeling the rough wood beneath my fingertips. The glass was cold, too cold, as if it had been there for years without a single disturbance. I couldn't find a latch, no lock, no hinge to indicate that this was a normal window. The frame was thick, almost like it was part of the wall itself, and the room on the other side, still there, still glowing faintly. It was exactly the same. My mind struggled to make sense of it all. I tapped the glass with my knuckles, my breath coming in shallow bursts. The lamp flickered once, then stayed on. casting its soft light across the small, simple room. But there was no movement on the other side. I knocked again. The silence that followed was oppressive. My stomach sank. I spent the next few days combing through the house. I searched every room, every closet, every hidden corner. I climbed into the attic, thinking maybe there was some secret passage leading to the room behind the wall. But no, there was nothing. The hallway remained empty, save for the strange window that continued to stare back at me, holding its mystery, holding its secrets. No answers, just more questions. And the strangest part? Every time I looked through that window, the room remained the same. The bed was always made, the lamp always glowing, and the dresser was always in the same place. It was as if time stood still on the other side, no sign of life, no movement. But I knew that something was there. Something or someone. I couldn't let it go. I had to know more. So I stood there again, staring through the glass, watching, waiting. The unease in my chest only grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me back. That's when I first noticed it. A figure, a shadow, standing by the foot of the bed, just outside the circle of light from the lamp. It was still, unmoving, as if it was waiting for me to notice it. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and my throat went dry. Was it my reflection? Was I imagining it? But as I leaned in closer, I could see it more clearly. The shape, the outline of a figure standing in the shadows of the room. It was not a trick of the light. It was real, and it was watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes were locked on the figure standing in the shadows of the small room beyond the glass. It hadn't moved, but I could feel its presence, a weight pressing down on me from the other side. The air around me felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The figure was dark, too dark to make out any details, but it was unmistakable in its stillness. For a moment I wondered if I was imagining it, my mind playing tricks on me after days of obsessing over this strange window, this impossible discovery. I blinked rapidly, tried to shake the feeling, but when I opened my eyes again, the figure was still there. My pulse quickened. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand here staring at the window like an idiot. I needed to know more, to understand what was happening in that room. But the closer I got to the glass, the more I realized how utterly powerless I was. I couldn't reach it. I couldn't touch it. It was as though there was a barrier between us, something I couldn't cross. It didn't matter how much I knocked or pressed my face against the glass. The figure didn't respond. I stepped back, feeling my heart pound in my chest. The figure remained, motionless, like a shadow carved out of the darkness. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't some bizarre reflection of me. It was separate, real, and waiting. I had to know who, or what, it was. But first, I needed to figure out how to open that damned window. I ran my fingers along the edges of the frame, searching for any kind of latch, any indication that it could be moved. There was nothing. The glass was old, thick, and tightly sealed within the wooden frame, as though it had never been touched. I knocked again, louder this time, but no response came. The figure, though still present, made no move, no sound. It was as if the room beyond was trapped in time, forever frozen in a moment where nothing changed. I couldn't keep standing there, helpless. I turned away from the window, suddenly desperate to explore the house again. Maybe there was something I had missed. Maybe there was a way to get inside that room, a secret passage hidden somewhere that would give me the answers I needed. I spent the next few hours combing through every inch of the house. I ripped up floorboards in the hallway, searched every closet, and pulled every loose stone from the fireplace, hoping for a hidden compartment or passage. My hands were raw from the work, but my mind was focused only on one thing: that room, that window, and the figure that seemed to watch me whenever I wasn't looking. But I found nothing. The house had no secret doors, no hidden tunnels. It was exactly as it appeared on the outside. Nothing more, nothing less. As the evening grew darker, I returned to the hallway, exhausted but determined. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. What was that figure? Why was it there in that strange room behind the window? And why couldn't I open it? Why was it so stubbornly shut off from the rest of the world? I paced back and forth in the hallway, the silence pressing in on me. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside seemed amplified in the stillness of the house. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, a soft thud, like something heavy falling onto the floor. I froze, heart leaping into my throat. It had come from the hallway. I didn't move for a moment, too afraid to even breathe. Then, slowly, I turned and looked down the corridor. The hallway was empty, save for the dust motes floating lazily in the air. But the thud had been real, I knew it. It hadn't been my imagination. The silence stretched out before me again, but this time, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Something was wrong. I wasn't alone in the house anymore. I slowly walked toward the source of the sound, my footsteps barely making a sound on the worn floorboards. My mind raced with possibilities. Could someone have broken in? Could the figure in the window somehow be real, and had it crossed over into my world? The thought made my stomach twist. I reached the spot where I'd heard the thud, but there was nothing. Nothing except an old, crooked painting that hung at an odd angle on the wall. It wasn't much, just a dull landscape of a sea, but it had always looked out of place in the hallway. My eyes fell on it, and then I noticed it. The corner of the frame seemed slightly askew, as though someone had pushed it just enough to make it crooked. My heart skipped a beat. I approached the painting, my hand trembling as I touched the frame. I pulled gently, and it shifted with a soft creak. A rush of air hit my face, as if something inside had just moved. The painting swung open with an audible click, revealing a small, narrow doorway behind it. I stumbled back, gasping for breath. Behind the painting was a small door, hidden from view by the cluttered, overgrown frame. The door was made of old wood, dark and weathered, just like the rest of the house. But what caught my attention was the faint, glowing light that seeped out from the crack between the door and the frame. The light was the same soft, eerie glow that had come from the room beyond the window. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I reached for the doorknob. My fingers brushed the cold metal, and for a moment I hesitated. This was insane. I had no idea what lay behind that door, but the pull of the mystery was too strong, and I knew I couldn't leave it unsolved. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, and the light spilled out, bathing the hallway in its strange, otherworldly glow. The room beyond was small, just like the one I had seen in the window, but there was something different about it. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and something else, something that I couldn't quite place. It was a feeling more than a smell, an almost oppressive sense of wrongness that seemed to hang in the air. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was nearly identical to the one behind the window, with a narrow bed, a simple wooden dresser, and a small side table. But now that I was standing inside it, I could see the details more clearly. The bed was unmade, the comforter haphazardly thrown across the mattress, as if someone had just gotten up. The lamp on the table flickered, its light pulsing in time with my heartbeat. But there was no one in the room. The room was empty. Yet, as I took another step forward, I felt the unmistakable sensation that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a chill ran down my spine. The presence I had felt earlier, on the other side of the window, was still here. I scanned the room again, my pulse racing. There was no sign of the figure, no movement, but the air felt thick with tension, as though something, or someone, was lurking just out of sight. And then, from the corner of the room, I saw it. A small black object sitting on the floor just beside the dresser. It was a book. A thick leather-bound book, its pages worn with age. I knelt down slowly, my fingers trembling as I reached for it. The moment my hand touched the cover, I felt a jolt of cold, like electricity running through my fingertips. I yanked my hand back, startled, but the feeling lingered, crawling up my arm like something alive. The book remained there, untouched, but the sensation was enough to make me hesitate. I wasn't sure what I was dealing with anymore. Everything about this house felt wrong, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep playing this game. But the pull of the mystery was too strong. With a final glance around the room, I grabbed the book and stood up, the weight of it heavy in my hands. I wasn't sure if I was ready for the truth, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered every secret this house was hiding. I could feel the book's weight pressing down on my hands as I made my way back to the narrow hallway. The room behind me, the one with the strange glowing light, seemed to pulse, almost alive with an energy I couldn't quite comprehend. Every part of me screamed to leave, to run away from the house, from whatever dark force seemed to be rooted here. But I couldn't. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew I was too close to the truth to turn back now. I needed answers. The book was still warm to the touch, an odd sensation that only added to the unease crawling up my spine. As I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoed louder than they should have, the silence pressing in around me. Every door, every corner, seemed to be watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I could feel the house shifting, responding to my presence, as though it were alive, breathing, watching, waiting. I found my way back to the room where I had first discovered the window, the room that seemed to be the source of everything. The figure, the window, the strange sensation that had been creeping up on me since I arrived. Everything had started here, and now I was back. The book heavy in my hands, the only source of knowledge I could rely on. The figure in the window was gone. I hadn't expected it to still be there, but the emptiness left behind in its place made the room feel colder, darker, as though it had never been anything more than a fleeting shadow. Still, the air was thick, suffused with a strange energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I glanced at the window, solid and unyielding as ever, and then at the book. I had to open it. I had to know what was inside. I sat down on the floor, back against the wall, and placed the book in front of me. The cover was old, cracked with age, its dark leather surface smooth to the touch. There was no title, no indication of what it might contain. The pages were yellowed, fragile, as though they might disintegrate the moment I touched them. My hands shook as I opened it, my eyes scanning the first few lines of text. The words were written in a language I couldn't understand. They weren't any script I recognized, nothing from any book, any document I had ever seen. They danced across the page, curving in a way that made my head ache as if the very act of reading them was wrong. But the further I turned the pages, the more something deep inside me stirred. The book spoke to me, even though I couldn't make sense of it. And then I saw it. On the second to last page, there was a simple, jagged drawing, an outline of a figure standing in the window, the same figure I had seen through the glass, drawn in dark, swirling ink. The figure had no face, only darkness where the features should have been. But as I looked at it, I felt an overwhelming sense of recognition. I had seen that figure before. It was not a mere drawing. It was a memory, a fragment of something that had been buried deep within me, locked away. Suddenly the room seemed to shift. The walls seemed to warp and bend, and I could feel the space around me stretching, pulling, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. My vision blurred, and I had to steady myself against the floor as the room seemed to spiral out of control. The air grew thick with the scent of dust and decay, and then there was a voice I couldn't place, but I heard it as clearly as though it were speaking directly into my ear. "You shouldn't have come." I jerked back, heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one in the room with me. The voice, though, lingered in the air, hanging around me like a cloud. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things or if it was some lingering effect of the book, but the words had been clear, menacing. I wasn't alone. I stood up quickly, clutching the book to my chest. My breath came fast, and I could feel the panic rising in me. I had to get out. I had to leave. But the doorway I had entered through, was gone. It wasn't just closed. It wasn't even there anymore. In its place was a solid wall of stone, as if the house itself had shifted, sealing me inside. My pulse raced as I scanned the room, desperate for any sign of escape. My gaze fell once again on the window. The window was open. I didn't know how it had happened. I hadn't heard any sound, no creak of the frame or shifting of the glass, but it was open, wide open, and the night air rushed into the room like a cold breath. Through the open window, I could see the figure again, standing just beyond the glass. It was still dark, its form a shadow against the night. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. I couldn't explain why, but I walked toward the window. I felt drawn to it, my feet moving of their own accord. The book felt heavier in my hands with every step, as if it were pulling me toward something, toward the figure, toward the truth. I reached the window and looked out. The figure was still there. And then, in the moment that followed, I saw something else. Something I hadn't noticed before. Something hidden in the darkness. Beyond the figure, in the shadows, was another figure. A faint silhouette, barely visible, but unmistakable. It was a child. My heart stopped. The child was small, no older than 5 or 6. Its face was hidden, but the feeling of pure dread that washed over me was undeniable. It was as if the child had been waiting for me to uncover the secret. The two figures, one tall, dark, and faceless, the other small and hidden in the shadows, were connected. I realized then, in that chilling moment, that they weren't separate entities at all. They were one. The figure in the window, the child in the shadows, they were parts of the same being. And that being had been waiting for me to find it. The book fell from my hands as I stepped back, a sense of vertigo washing over me. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the air heavy with an unspoken truth. The figure in the window moved, slowly, deliberately, and for the first time, I saw it. The blackness that had once hidden its face was gone. In its place was a pale, blank face, a mask with no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin, staring at me. It was as though it had no identity of its own, no form except that which I gave it. And then it spoke. "You are the last." The words reverberated through my mind, shattering everything I thought I knew. I staggered back, my heart pounding, as the figure in the window reached out toward me. The air was filled with a sudden rush of wind, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift. The walls of the room twisted, and the window, still open, felt like a doorway, a portal between worlds. "You are the last," it repeated, the voice louder now, echoing through the house. I turned to run, but the door, the wall of stone, remained in place. There was no escape. I was trapped. And then, as if the house itself had finally made its decision, everything went dark. The last thing I heard was the faint sound of a child's laughter, distant and haunting. All right, let me take my time to craft this story for you. Here's a spooky bedtime tale retold with fresh characters, simpler language, and a haunting tone suitable for young listeners. Hi, kids. You might think this is just a story, but it really happened. It was told to me by someone who swore it was true. Let me tell you about it. A long time ago, there was a ship called the Starlight. It wasn't fancy like the ones you see in movies, but it was strong. The ship's captain, Eldon Marsh, was a quiet man with a big gray beard and eyes like he had seen too much. Eldon always said the sea could be your best friend or your worst enemy. And one stormy night, it showed its worst. The crew was a mix of people from all over. There was Jonah, a young deckhand from a tiny fishing village who wanted to save money to buy his mother a house. Then there was Callie, the ship's cook, known for her big laugh and even bigger meals. She always made sure no one went to bed hungry. But the two most important people in this story were Marcus and Flynn. Marcus was the ship's second mate, a tall man with a loud voice who liked to act tougher than he really was. Flynn was different. He was the assistant engineer, a thinker, always fixing something with his greasy hands. He had a strange way of looking at people like he could see right through them. The Starlight was carrying dangerous cargo that night, barrels of fuel and crates of dynamite. Captain Eldon warned the crew to be careful, but no one could have prepared for what was about to happen. It started when dark clouds rolled in faster than anyone expected. The wind howled like a wild animal, and the waves grew taller than buildings. The Starlight fought hard, creaking and groaning as it slammed through the waves. Everyone was on edge, shouting orders and tying down anything that could move. Then, it happened. A flash of lightning lit up the sky, and a deafening crack followed. That bolt didn't just light up the night, it struck the ship's deck right where the dynamite was stored. The explosion was so loud, it felt like the world had ended. Flames shot into the air, and the Starlight started breaking apart. "Abandon ship!" Captain Eldon roared. Everyone scrambled for the lifeboats, but in the panic, no one counted heads or balanced the boats properly. One lifeboat launched with only 10 people. It had plenty of room left. Another had over 30 people crammed into it, and a small raft floated off by itself with just 2 frightened crew members. I can only imagine what it was like on that overcrowded lifeboat. Marcus took charge, barking orders like he was still on the Starlight. Flynn sat quietly, staring at the horizon, as if trying to calculate their chances. Jonah clung to the side of the boat, seasick and terrified. For the first night they rowed hard, hoping to find land. At sunrise they saw it, an island far in the distance. Everyone cheered. But then, the wind changed. The currents pulled them away, and the island disappeared. Days turned into nights, and hope began to fade. Each person got just a sip of water and a tiny piece of biscuit each day. Flynn was the first to suggest rationing. "If we run out too soon, we won't last," he said calmly. But even with the rations, people grew weak. Jonah's hands blistered from rowing, and Callie, the cook, who was always so full of life, grew quieter each day. On the 7th day, things got worse. The water was gone, the food was gone. Some of the crew started drinking seawater, even though they knew it was dangerous. Those who did got sick and didn't last long. Flynn was the one who came up with an idea to catch rainwater, even though it hadn't rained in days. Using scraps from the boat and bits of clothing, he made a funnel to collect any drops that might fall. But the skies stayed dry. When the first person passed away, it was devastating. Marcus insisted they give the man a proper farewell. But Flynn, always the thinker, spoke up. "We need to survive," he said. The silence that followed was heavier than the waves. No one wanted to say it, but they all knew what Flynn meant. Jonah refused to even look at the others, and Callie cried quietly. But hunger changes people. On the 9th day, Marcus made the decision. Flynn fashioned a knife into a fishing tool, using what was left of the man's body as bait. It wasn't long before they caught fish. For a moment it felt like hope. They cooked the fish using scraps of wood and ate as much as they could. But the truth of how they got the fish hung over them like a shadow. After 24 days they spotted land again. This time they didn't celebrate right away. They had learned not to trust the sea. But as they got closer, their boat tipped over in the waves. Jonah, Marcus, and Flynn managed to swim to shore, though their bodies were battered and weak. Callie didn't make it. She was too weak to fight the waves. When they finally crawled onto the sand, they were met by villagers who helped them recover. But not all stories have happy endings. Only 14 of the 32 people in that lifeboat survived to tell the tale. Years later, Flynn wrote a book about what happened. He didn't shy away from the truth, even the darkest parts. Some called him brave for telling the story. Others called it horrifying. But Flynn always said the same thing. We did what we had to do to survive. And that, kids, is why the sea is both a friend and an enemy. It can give you life, but it can also test you in ways you never imagined. So the next time you hear the waves crashing, remember the story of the Starlight and the brave, or desperate, people who tried to conquer it. My name is David, and I need to tell you about the scariest night of my life. I wish I could forget it, but every time I close my eyes, I still see the shadows and hear the whispers. It all started when my parents took me to visit my uncle's old house deep in the countryside. The house wasn't like the ones you see in pictures. It wasn't cozy or warm. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in a scary movie, the kind where you yell at the characters not to go inside. But I didn't have a choice. We arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to set. The sky had turned orange and purple, and the trees around the house cast long, jagged shadows. The house itself was huge, with peeling paint, broken shutters, and a roof that looked like it might fall apart at any moment. The porch creaked under our feet as we walked up to the front door, and the air smelled damp, like the earth after heavy rain. Uncle John greeted us at the door. He was tall and thin, with gray hair and glasses that made his eyes look too big for his face. He smiled, but there was something nervous about him, like he was trying too hard to act normal. "Welcome," he said, stepping aside so we could enter. I hope the drive wasn't too long. The hallway inside was dim, even with the lights on. The walls were covered with faded wallpaper that had flowers on it, but most of the pattern had peeled away, revealing cracked plaster underneath. There were old paintings of people I didn't recognize staring down at us from dusty frames. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I walked. "This place is big," I said, trying to sound polite. Uncle John chuckled. "It's been in the family for generations. Needs a little fixing up, but it's got character." My mom smiled and told him it was charming, but I could tell she didn't mean it. My dad didn't say much. He just carried the suitcases up the stairs while my mom helped Uncle John in the kitchen. I was left to explore, which, looking back, might have been my first mistake. I wandered down the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the wooden floor. The air felt heavy, like it hadn't moved in years. I passed a sitting room with dusty couches and a fireplace filled with ashes. Further down, there was a door that wouldn't open no matter how hard I pushed. At the very end of the hall, I found the staircase leading up to the second floor. The stairs groaned under my weight as I climbed. The higher I went, the darker it got, even though the windows let in the last rays of sunlight. When I reached the top, I saw another long hallway, lined with doors. Most of them were closed, but one near the end was slightly open. I could see just enough of the room to know it was empty, or so I thought. I was about to turn back when I saw it, the shadow. It was in the far corner of the room, still and silent. My first thought was that it was a coat rack or maybe a piece of furniture, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was shaped like a person. I froze. It didn't move. I told myself it was a trick of the light, my imagination playing games with me. But as I stepped closer, my stomach tightened. The shadow wasn't blurry or faded like normal shadows. It was sharp, like it had edges, and it didn't stretch or bend with the light. Then it turned. Not all the way, just enough that I could tell it was looking at me. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat felt dry, and my legs felt like they were stuck to the floor. The shadow didn't come closer, but it didn't go away either. It just stood there, as if it were waiting for something. Suddenly, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. I spun around, and there was Uncle John. "What are you doing up here?" he asked, his voice sharp. I pointed to the room. "There's someone in there." Uncle John looked past me, then stepped forward and opened the door all the way. The room was empty. No furniture, no shadows, nothing. Just dusty floors and cracked walls. "There's no one here," he said, giving me a strange look. But I saw, "You're probably just tired. This house can play tricks on you. Go back downstairs and wash up for dinner." I didn't argue. I just turned and ran down the stairs. But even as I left the second floor behind, I felt like something was watching me. Dinner was quiet. My parents talked about their plans for the weekend, and Uncle John told stories about fixing the old place. I tried to eat, but my stomach felt too tight. I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow. Later that night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The walls creaked as the wind blew outside, and the branches of the trees tapped against the windows. I kept telling myself it was just an old house making noises, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then I heard it, a soft whisper. At first, I thought it was my parents talking in the next room, but when I listened closer, I realized it was coming from above me. The attic. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The whispers were faint, like someone was mumbling just out of earshot. I crept out of bed and tiptoed toward the door. The hallway was dark, and the wooden floor felt cold under my feet. I followed the sound to the staircase leading to the attic. The door at the top was cracked open, just enough to let the whisper slip through. I wanted to run, but something pulled me forward. I climbed the stairs one step at a time, holding my breath with each creak. When I reached the top, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The attic was filled with old boxes and furniture covered in sheets. Dust floated in the air, and the smell of mildew made my nose itch. The whispers stopped the moment I entered. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined them. But then I saw it. The same shadow I'd seen before, standing at the far end of the attic. It was closer this time, and it was moving. I stepped back, but my foot hit a loose board and it creaked. The shadow froze. Then it lunged. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, slamming the attic door behind me. I raced down the stairs and back to my room, locking the door and diving under the covers. I stayed there, trembling, until the first light of morning crept through the windows. When my parents asked why I looked so tired, I didn't tell them. I didn't think they'd believe me. But as we packed our bags to leave, I glanced up at the attic window. The shadow was there, watching, waiting, and I knew this wasn't over. The ride home felt longer than it should have. My parents chatted about how nice it was to see Uncle John again, but I sat in silence, staring out the car window. Trees blurred past, their branches twisting like fingers reaching out. I tried to convince myself that what I had seen in Uncle John's attic was just my imagination, but the memory of the shadow wouldn't leave me. It wasn't just fear that lingered. It was the feeling that it wasn't over. That shadow had seen me, and somehow I knew it hadn't forgotten. When we pulled into our driveway, the sight of our ordinary house with its bright windows and tidy lawn should have comforted me. It didn't. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the same heavy weight I'd felt in Uncle John's house, like the air was too thick to breathe. I shook it off and forced myself to go about my normal routine. My parents acted like nothing was wrong, so I tried to do the same. I unpacked my bag, changed into clean clothes, and even played video games to distract myself. But that night, as I lay in bed, the whispers returned. At first, I thought I was dreaming. My room was completely dark except for the faint glow of my nightlight, but the sound, low and raspy, was unmistakable. I sat up, my heart pounding. The whispers were coming from the corner of my room, where the shadows gathered under my desk. "No," I whispered to myself. "Not here." I reached for the lamp on my nightstand and turned it on. Light flooded the room, chasing the shadows away. For a moment, everything seemed normal again. But then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The shadow under my desk was still there. It wasn't fading or bending like the other shadows. It stayed solid, unmoving, and when I stared at it, I saw something that made my breath catch. 2 glowing eyes. I froze. The eyes didn't blink. They just stared at me, and I felt an icy chill crawl up my spine. I wanted to scream for my parents, but my voice wouldn't come out. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight I kept in my drawer and aimed it at the shadow. Nothing happened. The light didn't make it go away. Instead, the eyes moved, closer. I scrambled off my bed and bolted for the door, but as I reached for the handle, the whispers grew louder. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, overlapping and hissing words I couldn't understand. I yanked the door open and ran down the hall to my parents' room. "Mom! Dad!" I shouted, banging on the door. My mom opened it, bleary-eyed and confused. "David, what's wrong?" "There's something in my room," I cried. "I saw it. It was in the shadows." My dad appeared behind her, rubbing his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "The shadow. It followed me from Uncle John's house." They exchanged worried looks, and my mom knelt down to put her hands on my shoulders. "Honey, you're just tired. That house was old and creepy, and you probably had a bad dream." "No, I wasn't dreaming." My dad sighed. "Let's go check it out." I followed him back to my room, my heart still racing. He flipped on the light, and we both looked around. Nothing. No shadows, no glowing eyes, just my messy room. "You see?" he said. "It's fine. But you're stressed," he interrupted. "Get some sleep. You'll feel better in the morning." I didn't argue. I knew they wouldn't believe me no matter what I said. But as I climbed back into bed and watched my dad turn off the light, I felt the weight of the shadows pressing in again. This time I didn't sleep. The next few days were a blur. I tried to pretend everything was normal, but the whispers didn't stop. They came every night, growing louder and closer. I barely slept, and at school, I couldn't concentrate. My friends noticed something was wrong, but I couldn't tell them the truth. They'd think I was crazy. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to do something I'd been dreading since we left Uncle John's house. I called him. He answered on the second ring. "David, is everything okay?" "No," I said. "It followed me." There was silence on the other end. Then he said, "I was afraid of that." "What do you mean? You knew?" He sighed. "I didn't want to scare you, but that house has a history. My parents always told me to stay away from the attic, but I didn't listen. When I was your age, I saw the same thing you did. The shadows, the eyes, and once you see them, they don't let you go." I gripped the phone tighter. "How do I make it stop?" "There's only one way," he said. "You have to face it." "What? No, I can't." "Listen to me," he interrupted. "The shadows feed on fear. The more afraid you are, the stronger they get. You need to go back to the attic and confront it. Otherwise, it'll never leave you alone." I wanted to hang up. I wanted to pretend this wasn't happening. But deep down, I knew he was right. That night, I prepared myself. I packed a flashlight, a lighter, and a small knife from the kitchen, just in case. My parents were asleep, so I crept out of the house and rode my bike back to Uncle John's. The house looked even worse in the dark. The windows were black, and the porch creaked as I stepped onto it. I used the spare key Uncle John had given my dad and let myself inside. The air was thick and cold. The whispers started immediately, louder than ever. I forced myself to move, climbing the stairs to the attic. The door was open just like before. The shadow was waiting. This time I didn't freeze. I stepped inside, holding the flashlight out in front of me. The beam of light didn't chase the shadow away, but it didn't move either. "I'm not afraid of you," I shouted, though my voice shook. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me. The shadow started to shift, stretching toward me. I flicked the lighter and held up the flame. "Stay back." For the first time, the shadow hesitated. The whispers faltered. I took another step closer. "You don't scare me anymore." The shadow let out a shriek, a horrible, high-pitched sound that made my ears ring. Then it started to fade, shrinking into the corners of the room until it disappeared completely. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I ran out of the attic, locked the door, and didn't stop running until I was back home, safe in my bed. For the first time in days, I slept peacefully. But even now, I can't help but wonder, what if it wasn't gone? What if it's still watching? And what if it's waiting to come back? I woke the next morning feeling lighter, as though the weight of the past few days had finally lifted. The attic was locked, the shadows banished, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed the nightmare was over. But deep down, something still gnawed at me. I tried to brush it off as leftover fear, a phantom sensation from facing the shadow. Yet as I got ready for school, I couldn't ignore the faint echo of whispers lingering at the edge of my hearing. By the time I made it to class, the whispers had faded completely. I almost convinced myself it was my imagination, but when the lights in the classroom flickered during math, my heart sank. "Relax," I told myself. "It's just a coincidence." But coincidences don't make the temperature drop 10 degrees in the span of seconds. I could feel it again, watching. After school, I went straight to Uncle John's house. He opened the door before I even knocked, as though he'd been expecting me. "It's not over," I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Uncle John's face was pale. "I was afraid of that. You said it would stop if I faced it." "I thought it would," he admitted, "but I should have known better." "What do you mean?" Uncle John led me into the living room and gestured for me to sit. He pulled an old photo album from the bookshelf and set it on the coffee table. As he flipped through the pages, he pointed to black and white photographs of the house. "This place has always been wrong," he said. "My parents never talked about it, but after they died, I started digging. The attic wasn't just a storage space. It was part of something much older." I leaned in closer, studying the photos. The attic window appeared in almost every picture, but it was never clear. No matter how bright the day, the glass always looked dark, like a void. "What is it?" I asked. Uncle John turned the page to a faded newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Family vanishes without a trace. Only shadows remain." "This happened in 1943, he said. "A family lived here, 2 parents and their daughter. One night, the neighbors heard screams, but when the police arrived, the house was empty. The only thing they found was a black stain in the attic that couldn't be cleaned." My stomach churned. "And you stayed here?" "I thought it was just a story," he said, "until I saw it for myself. And now you've seen it too." I swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Uncle John hesitated before answering. "We end it, for good." That night, we prepared for war. Uncle John gathered salt, candles, and a strange book filled with symbols I couldn't understand. He handed me a piece of chalk and told me to draw a circle around us when we reached the attic. "Once we start, we can't leave the circle," he warned. "No matter what happens, don't step outside it." I nodded, though my hands trembled. We climbed the stairs together, and I felt the air grow heavier with each step. By the time we reached the attic door, the whispers had returned, louder than ever. Uncle John lit the candles, and I drew the circle. The moment we stepped inside, the shadows surged toward us. "They know what we're doing," Uncle John shouted over the rising whispers. "Stay focused." He opened the book and began to chant. The words were strange, sharp and guttural, and as he spoke, the shadows writhed like living things. The temperature dropped, and the candles flickered. I gripped the chalk so tightly my knuckles turned white. Suddenly the shadows lunged. They slammed against the edge of the circle, but the chalk line held. The shadows recoiled, hissing like snakes. Uncle John kept chanting, his voice growing louder. The shadows thrashed, forming shapes, faces twisted in rage and sorrow. Then the eyes appeared. They rose from the center of the attic, glowing with an unnatural light. This time there were dozens of them, staring at us with hatred. I wanted to run, but Uncle John's voice kept me grounded. "Don't stop!" he shouted, flipping to another page in the book. The shadows howled, and the attic shook. Dust fell from the rafters, and cracks formed in the walls. I thought the entire house was going to collapse, but Uncle John didn't falter. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small vial. "Salt and fire," he said. "It's the only way." Before I could stop him, he stepped out of the circle. "No!" I screamed. But it was too late. The shadows swarmed him, pulling at his limbs and dragging him toward the center of the room. He threw the vial to the ground, and flames erupted, scattering the shadows. Uncle John fell to his knees, gasping for breath. "Finish it!" he shouted. I grabbed the book, but the words swam on the page. I couldn't focus. The shadows were closing in again, and Uncle John's screams filled the air. I forced myself to read, my voice trembling. The shadows recoiled, but they didn't retreat. The fire was dying, and Uncle John was fading fast. "Hold on!" I yelled, but deep down, I knew he couldn't. With one final chant, I threw the book into the flames. The shadows shrieked, and the entire attic lit up with blinding light. When the light faded, the shadows were gone. But so was Uncle John. The fire department said it was an accident. That faulty wiring caused the blaze. They never found Uncle John's body, just ash and debris. My parents believed the story. Everyone did. But I knew the truth. The house was destroyed, but the shadows weren't gone. I could feel them, lurking at the edges of my vision, waiting, watching. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. But now I'm not afraid, because I know their secret. Shadows can never die, but neither can the light. I never wanted to move into that old house on Willow Street. It wasn't just old, it felt wrong, like it had been forgotten by the world, tucked away in the shadow of overgrown trees and cracked sidewalks. But I didn't have a choice. Money was tight, and the rent was so low that it almost felt like a trap. The house was a 3-story building with faded gray paint that peeled off like dead skin. Its windows were tall and narrow, and they stared out like eyes, empty, hollow, and watching. My room was on the second floor, but the thing that stuck with me the most wasn't the creaky floorboards or the crooked walls. It was the staircase. The spiral staircase sat right in the middle of the house. It was massive, stretching from the dusty basement all the way up to the attic, where the landlord kept old furniture and boxes no one dared to open. The staircase didn't look normal, though. The steps were narrow and uneven, and they creaked loud enough to make my teeth hurt. The railing was made of cold iron twisted into shapes that almost looked like faces if you stared too long. And the worst part? The middle of the staircase was hollow, like a giant well. If you leaned over the railing, you could see all the way down to the dark basement, where shadows swallowed everything. I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself it was just an old staircase, part of the house's character. That's what the landlord said anyway. "It's got charm," he'd told me with a crooked smile as he handed me the keys. But there was no charm in that house. Not after dark. My first night there was quiet. Too quiet. The neighbors didn't make any noise, and the street outside was dead. Even the wind seemed afraid to touch the place. I set up my furniture quickly. A mattress on the floor, a desk by the window, and a single lamp that cast long shadows against the walls. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard the groaning sound of the staircase. It wasn't just one noise. It was several. Like footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps moving up and down. But whenever I opened my door and checked, there was nothing. Just the hollow center of the spiral, yawning into darkness. I told myself it was the house settling. Old wood makes noise. That's what people say, right? I didn't believe it, but it helped me get through the night. The next day, I explored the house. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges like loose skin. Some of the rooms still had furniture, a rocking chair that swayed even though there was no breeze, a cracked mirror that didn't seem to reflect the light properly. The attic door was locked. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Probably for the best, I thought. The basement door, though, wasn't locked. It stood slightly open, like it was waiting for someone to come down. I didn't go in. Not yet. By the time night fell again, I had almost convinced myself the noises were just my imagination. I stayed up late, working on my laptop and trying not to think about the staircase. Around midnight, I decided to grab a soda from the kitchen. That's when I saw it. I stepped out of my room and froze. The hallway light flickered, and the staircase loomed in front of me. Something about it felt heavier than before, like the shadows were thicker. I looked down the center, expecting to see nothing but darkness. But there was a shape. It was faint at first, just a darker spot in the shadows. It shifted slightly like it was breathing. My throat tightened, and my legs felt locked in place. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. The shape was still there. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on it. My heart pounded so loud I was sure it could hear me. I didn't stop until I was back in my room with the door shut tight. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I tried to tell myself it was nothing. A trick of the light. Shadows can look like shapes if you stare long enough. That's all it was. But it wasn't. Over the next few days, the noises got worse. The creaking steps became louder, more deliberate, like someone was climbing them slowly. I tried using the elevator once, but it shuddered and jerked between floors, and I felt like I was going to be trapped. So I stuck to the stairs, even though every step made my skin crawl. One night, around 1 a.m., I couldn't resist the hunger gnawing at my stomach. I decided to go down to the kitchen. I told myself I'd be quick. I opened the door to the hallway and the light outside flickered again. My palms were sweaty, but I forced myself to step toward the staircase. The shadows seemed darker, stretching up the walls like long fingers. I gripped the railing as I started down, and the cold metal burned against my skin. Each step groaned under my weight, and the sound echoed through the hollow center. I looked down. Just for a second, the shape was back. This time it moved. It shifted like it was turning to look at me, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I couldn't move. My legs felt frozen, but my mind screamed at me to run. Then the groaning got louder. It wasn't just my steps anymore. It was coming from below, from the shape. It was like the whole staircase was alive, groaning and creaking with every breath. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my room, slamming the door and locking it behind me. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the wood, waiting for the sound to follow me. But it didn't. I stayed awake until morning, and when the sunlight poured through the windows, I almost believed I had imagined it. Almost. I went back to the staircase during the day. It looked normal in the light. The steps were old but sturdy, and the shadows didn't seem as thick. I even leaned over the railing and looked down. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The staircase wasn't just old, it was hungry, and it was watching. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore it. I kept my head down, worked on my projects, and avoided the stairs whenever I could. But every night the sounds returned. The creaking, the groaning, and the shape. It got closer each time. One night around 2 a.m. I heard it again. This time it wasn't coming from below. It was above me. I froze, staring at my ceiling as the groaning sound crept closer. Step by step it moved toward my door. I didn't sleep at all that night. By the end of the week, I was exhausted. My eyes burned and my hands shook every time I touched the railing. I started feeling like the staircase wasn't just a part of the house. It was alive. and it wanted something. I wasn't sure what, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I told myself I'd start looking for a new place. I didn't care about the money anymore. I just needed to get out. But before I could pack, I had to do laundry, and the laundry room was in the basement. I stood at the top of the staircase, staring down into the darkness below. The shape was waiting. I could feel it. I took a deep breath, grabbed my laundry basket, and started down. And that's when everything changed. I stood at the top of the staircase, staring into the void below. The basement wasn't just dark, it felt heavier, like the air itself thickened the farther down it went. My fingers tightened around the laundry basket, and for a moment, I considered leaving it behind. But I couldn't. I needed clean clothes, and I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid of this house. Fear was just an illusion, something I'd built up in my mind after too many sleepless nights and too many strange noises. That's what I told myself as I placed my foot on the first step. The stairs creaked, louder than they should have. The sound seemed to echo, spiraling down into the depths. I tried to focus on the task at hand, just get to the laundry room and get out, but my eyes kept drifting to the hollow center of the spiral staircase. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. As I descended, the air grew colder, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made your skin prickle. My foot slipped on one of the steps and my heart leaped into my throat. The basket wobbled in my arms, but I caught myself on the railing. The metal was freezing. I glanced down, and for a split second I saw it. The shape. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was clearer now, almost human, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, and its head tilted unnaturally, like it was straining to look up at me. I stumbled back, skipping the last few steps and landing hard on the basement floor. The basket hit the ground, scattering clothes around my feet. I didn't stop. I scrambled to the light switch and flipped it on. The bulb flickered before buzzing to life. The basement looked normal, or as normal as it could. The walls were unfinished, and the floor was cracked concrete. Rusted pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping water that echoed in the quiet space. The laundry machine sat against the far wall, humming softly. No sign of the shape. I forced myself to breathe, though my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I hurried to gather the scattered clothes and shove them into the washing machine. The sooner I finished, the sooner I could get out. But as I turned the dial, something shifted behind me. It wasn't loud, just the faintest scrape, like nails against concrete. I froze. My eyes darted to the reflection in the glass door of the washing machine. There it was. It stood at the edge of the shadows, just outside the reach of the light. Its body was hunched, and its fingers, too long and sharp, curled around the edge of the doorway. My breath caught. I spun around, but it was gone. No, not gone. I could still feel it, watching. I backed toward the stairs, my legs trembling. The washing machine buzzed as it started its cycle, but the sound was drowned out by another noise, the creaking of the staircase. The steps groaned one by one, slow and deliberate, as though something was descending. I gripped the railing and started climbing, my feet moving faster than my thoughts. The creaking grew louder, and I didn't dare look down. I didn't need to. I could feel it behind me. Halfway up, I slipped. My knee slammed into the edge of a step, and the pain shot through me like lightning. I cried out, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the railing as I hauled myself upward. The creaking stopped. For a second, I thought I was safe. Then something touched my ankle. I screamed. I kicked hard, my foot connecting with something solid, and I didn't stop until I burst through the door at the top of the stairs. I slammed it shut and locked it, my chest heaving. Silence. I backed away, staring at the door. The handle didn't move. No sound came from the other side, but I knew it was still there. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak, sent my heart racing. I sat with my back against the door, clutching the heaviest object I could find, a rusted wrench I'd found in one of the closets. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a hallucination. Stress, lack of sleep, my mind playing tricks. But when I went back downstairs later that day, the basement door was open. Not just open, wide open, the light inside flickering. And at the top of the stairs, sitting neatly in a pile, were my clothes. Folded. I didn't go back down. Instead, I called the landlord. When he answered, his voice was casual, almost cheerful. But when I told him what had happened, the tone shifted. "Ah," he said. "So you've seen it." I froze. "Seen what?" A long pause. "The staircase," he said finally. "It's old. Older than the house, even. I've tried sealing off the basement before, but it doesn't help." "It?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, almost a whisper. "You should leave," he said. "I can refund your deposit. Just don't stay there." "What is it?" I demanded, but he hung up. I stared at the phone, my skin crawling. He knew something he wasn't telling me. I tried to pack my things, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump, and the shadows seemed darker than before. That night, I locked myself in my room again. I kept the wrench by my bed, but I didn't feel safe. Around 3 a.m., I heard the noise. It started softly, just a faint creak, like someone shifting their weight. But then it grew louder. Step by step, it climbed. I held my breath, gripping the wrench so tightly my knuckles turned white. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I could see the shadow under the crack, long and thin, stretching across the floor. And then it knocked. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The handle rattled. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. I stayed awake until the sun rose, but the shadow was gone when I finally opened the door. I didn't go to work that day. I didn't leave my room. But when I finally worked up the courage to check the staircase again, something had changed. The railing was different. The twisted iron shapes weren't random anymore. They were faces, and one of them looked just like me. I couldn't move. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at the twisted iron railing. The face in the metal, my face, seemed to stare back, its hollow eyes brimming with silent terror. The cold dread in my stomach twisted into something sharper, more urgent. I had to get out. But even as I turned to run, the house shifted around me. The floor creaked, the shadows stretched, and the dim light in the hallway flickered. The air grew heavy again, pressing against my chest like invisible hands. The staircase groaned, not from above, from below. I spun around, and my blood ran cold. The basement door was open. No, I had locked it. I was sure I had locked it, but now it gaped wide, the darkness spilling out like ink, and the faint creak of footsteps echoed up the spiral stairs. I wanted to run, to flee the house and never look back, but something held me in place, a sickening curiosity, or maybe just fear so deep it paralyzed me. The steps grew louder. I gripped the rusted wrench until my palm ached. "Who's there?" I forced the words out, though my voice trembled. Silence. And then, a whisper. My name. It slithered up from the depths, soft and breathless, like a voice carried by the wind. I staggered back, but the whisper came again. "Come down." It wasn't just a voice, it was my voice. The walls seemed to close in, pressing me toward the staircase. My feet moved before I could stop them, carrying me down step by step. I didn't want to go, but something deeper than fear pulled me forward. The shadows in the basement thickened as I descended, swirling like smoke. The light overhead flickered and then died completely, plunging me into darkness. I stopped, my breath echoing in the stillness. "Hello?" The whisper came again, closer this time. "Come closer." I didn't realize I was moving until my foot touched the cold concrete floor. The air was thick and damp, and the faint hum of the washing machine had stopped. But something else had started. A low, rhythmic sound, like breathing. I turned toward the noise, raising the wrench, but the darkness swallowed everything. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the black, revealing the laundry machines and the cracked walls. But beyond them, where the basement should have ended, was another door. I froze. It hadn't been there before. The door was old, older than the rest of the basement, made of rotting wood and bound in rusted iron. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, the light from my phone trembling. The breathing sound was coming from behind it. I should have turned around. I should have run. But instead, I reached for the handle. It was ice cold beneath my fingers, and as I turned it, the door groaned open. The air that spilled out smelled of damp earth and decay. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement inside. I stepped through. The ground sloped downward, a narrow tunnel carved from rough stone. Roots dangled from the ceiling, brushing against my hair like skeletal fingers. The breathing grew louder, deeper. And then I saw it. The staircase. Not the one I'd just descended. This was older, carved into the stone itself. It spiraled downward, vanishing into the earth. At the edge of the steps stood a figure. It was me, or at least it looked like me. Its face was pale, its eyes hollow, and its lips twisted into a grin that stretched too wide. I staggered back, my flashlight trembling. The figure tilted its head, mirroring my movement. "No," I whispered. It stepped closer. I swung the wrench, but it passed through empty air. The figure laughed, a sound that echoed off the walls, sharp and mocking. "You can't fight this," it said in my voice. I turned and ran. The tunnel twisted around me, but the staircase was endless. No matter how far I climbed, I never reached the top. The shadows pressed closer, and the air grew heavier, thicker. The laughter followed me. I screamed, but the sound fell flat, swallowed by the dark. My phone flickered and died, plunging me into blackness. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My foot caught on something and I fell hard. Pain shot through my knee, but I barely felt it. I clawed at the stone, dragging myself upward. And then, light. Faint and flickering, but real. I pushed toward it, my chest burning, my vision blurring. I burst through the door and slammed it shut behind me. The basement was still dark, but the air was lighter. The whispers were gone. But I wasn't alone. The figure stood at the base of the stairs, staring up at me with hollow eyes. "You can't leave," it said. "You're already part of it." I didn't listen. I ran up the spiral staircase and out of the house, slamming the front door behind me. The cold night air hit me like a wave, and I collapsed onto the front porch, gasping for breath. The house was silent, but I could still feel it. The presence, the whispers, the endless spiral. I didn't go back inside. I called the landlord again, but the number was disconnected. When I tried to find records of the house, there was nothing. No property listings, no history, nothing. The police didn't believe me. No one did. I moved away, far away, but the nightmare still follows me. When I was 12 years old, back in the fall of 2005, my older brother Eli and I went on a camping trip with two of his friends, Jonah and Callum. It was my first real camping trip, and I was both excited and a little nervous. Eli, who was 17 at the time, had always been the adventurous type. He loved hiking, building campfires, and telling spooky stories. Jonah, 16, was the joker of the group, always cracking jokes and lightening the mood. Callum, who was 18, was quiet but dependable. He was the one who had the most camping experience and brought all the fancy gear. Our campsite was deep in the woods, a place Callum insisted was perfect. There was a small lake nearby, and Callum said it was his favorite spot to fish. The trees were tall and thick, making the whole area feel like it was hidden from the rest of the world. I'll admit, I was a little scared when we first got there. The woods felt huge and endless, but Eli promised we'd have a great time, so I decided to trust him. We spent the first day setting up our tents and gathering firewood. Jonah made us all laugh by pretending to struggle with his tent, even though it was obvious he knew what he was doing. Callum showed me how to build a campfire safely, and Eli helped me pitch my tent. By the time the sun started setting, everything was ready. We sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. Jonah told a funny story about getting lost on a hike once, but Callum's story was much more serious. "You know," he said, staring into the flames, "there's a legend about these woods. Some people call it the Shadow Walker." Eli groaned. "Come on, Callum. You're gonna scare my little brother." "I'm not scared," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Callum smirked. "The story goes that a long time ago, a man got lost in these woods. He wandered for days, but no one ever found him. They say his spirit still roams around, looking for a way out. But here's the creepy part. If you see him, his face looks like it's made of cloth, like an old sack, and if you stare at him too long, he'll take you with him into the woods." Jonah laughed. "Nice try, Callum, but ghosts don't exist." Even though I knew it was just a story, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder into the dark woods. That night, I slept in my own little tent while the others shared a bigger one. Eli had made sure I was warm and safe, and I fell asleep listening to the crackle of the campfire outside. The next morning, when I unzipped my tent, something was wrong. The fire pit we had carefully built was destroyed. Rocks were scattered everywhere, and ashes were smeared across the ground. Guys," I called out. Eli and the others came out of their tent, yawning and stretching. When they saw the mess, their sleepy faces turned serious. "What the heck happened here?" Eli asked. Jonah scratched his head. "Maybe an animal?" Callum shook his head. "No way. Animals wouldn't mess up the fire pit like this." Then we noticed something else. Callum's fishing gear, which he had left by the lake, was gone. The cooler we had packed with food was tipped over, and some of the snacks were missing. Eli looked worried. "Who would do this?" "Maybe some kids messing around," Jonah suggested, but his voice didn't sound so confident. That day we tried to brush it off. Callum and Eli took me hiking, and Jonah stayed back to clean up the campsite. By the time we got back, Jonah had everything looking normal again, and we spent the evening like nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I looked into the woods, it felt like something, or someone, was just out of sight. That night, I asked Eli if I could sleep in their tent instead of my own. He agreed, saying, "It's probably better if we all stick together." I felt safer with them, but I still had trouble falling asleep. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint, like footsteps crunching on leaves. "Eli," I whispered, "do you hear that?" He didn't answer. I peeked out of my sleeping bag and saw him lying still, his face turned away. Jonah and Callum were snoring softly. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again, closer this time. I don't know what made me do it, but I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, in the dim light of the dying campfire, I saw a figure standing near the trees. It was tall and thin, and its face looked like it was covered in cloth. I froze, too scared to even breathe. The figure didn't move, but it felt like it was staring right at me. I let the zipper go and backed away, my heart pounding. I shook Eli awake. "Eli, wake up. There's someone out there." He groaned and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What are you talking about?" I pointed to the tent flap, but when he looked outside, the figure was gone. "Go back to sleep, Noah," he said. "You're just imagining things." But I knew what I saw. The next morning, the campsite was worse than before. The fire pit was destroyed again, and someone had slashed the side of Jonah's tent. Eli didn't say anything. He just packed up our stuff as fast as he could, and we left. On the way home, I asked him if he believed me about the figure. At first, he said no, but later, when we stopped for gas, he admitted, "I think I saw something too. I just didn't want to scare you." We never talked about it again after that, but sometimes, late at night, I still think about the shadow walker and wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to wander into its woods. My name is Miles, and I live with my best friend, a dog named Rusty. He's a big, fluffy German shepherd who loves chasing butterflies and eating snacks I sneak him from the kitchen. Rusty and I moved here a year ago with my mom, Aunt Jess, and my little brother Toby. Our new home is a big old farm in the countryside. It has a huge field where Rusty loves to play, 2 big red barns, and trees that stretch all the way to the horizon. My mom says the farm used to belong to a family who moved away a long time ago. Aunt Jess says it's the perfect place to grow vegetables, but I think it's the perfect place to explore. The woods behind the farm are so big that sometimes I feel like they go on forever. Mom tells me not to go too far into the woods, especially after dark. The forest has stories of its own, she always says. I never really understood what she meant, until last night. It was a quiet evening. Aunt Jess was reading a book by the fireplace. Toby was asleep, and Mom was finishing cleaning the kitchen. Rusty and I were getting ready for his last walk before bedtime. The stars were out, and the moon was bright, lighting up the yard around the house. Rusty and I stepped out the back door. I clicked on my flashlight, and we headed toward the edge of the big field near the barn. Normally, Rusty would run ahead, sniffing the grass and chasing little bugs, but tonight he stayed close to me, his tail wagging just a little slower than usual. "Come on, Rusty," I said, patting his head. "It's just another walk. Same as always." We reached the old barn, which creaked in the wind. Mom said the barn hadn't been used in years, and sometimes Toby and I liked to play pretend there during the day. At night, though, the barn always seemed quieter. Too quiet. Rusty stopped suddenly, his ears standing straight up. He stared at the barn and let out a soft whine. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, crouching down next to him. He just stared, his nose twitching like he smelled something I couldn't. Then, from the trees behind the barn, I heard it. Who? At first, I thought it was an owl. I'd heard plenty of owls before, but this one sounded different. It was slower, like someone was trying to copy the sound of an owl, but not quite getting it right. I stood up and shined my flashlight toward the trees. Rusty started to growl, a deep, low rumble I'd never heard from him before. "Mom," I called, my voice shaky. No answer. I looked back at the house, but it was too far away to see the lights from here. Who? The sound came again, closer this time. Rusty stepped in front of me, his fur bristling. His growl got louder, and then he barked, a sharp, angry sound. Rusty never barks at people, not even the mailman. Whatever was out there, it wasn't friendly. I held onto Rusty's collar, trying to calm him down. My flashlight flickered, and the beam of light dimmed. The forest seemed darker than usual, like the shadows were getting closer. Then I heard it again. Who? But this time it sounded different. It wasn't just an owl sound anymore. It sounded like laughing. a deep, low laugh that echoed through the trees. I froze, holding Rusty close. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped the flashlight. Rusty barked again, louder this time, and started pulling toward the house. He wanted to leave, and so did I. "Let's go, Rusty," I whispered. I picked him up. It wasn't easy because he's heavy, and ran back toward the house. The wind picked up, and I could hear the barn doors creaking behind me. Halfway across the field, I stopped and looked back. The barn doors, which had been closed when we walked past earlier, were now wide open. The moonlight shone on the barn's old wooden floor, but there was something strange about it. The floor looked scratched, like something had been dragged across it. Rusty squirmed in my arms, and I tightened my grip. Whatever was in the barn, I didn't want to find out. When we finally made it back to the house, I slammed the door shut and locked it. Rusty kept growling, pacing around the kitchen like he was still on guard. Mom came in from the living room, looking worried. "What's wrong?" she asked. I told her everything, about the strange owl sound, the laughing, and the barn doors. Mom's face grew serious. She walked to the window and looked out at the barn. After a long moment, she pulled the curtains shut. "That's why we don't go near the barn at night," she said softly. "The forest doesn't like visitors after dark." "But what was it?" I asked. Mom didn't answer. She just hugged me tight and told me to stay inside after sunset from now on. The next morning, I went back to the barn with Mom and Aunt Jess. The doors were still open, just like I had seen them, but there was no sign of anyone, or anything. No footprints, no scratches on the walls, nothing. But I know what I heard, and so does Rusty. Now, every night before bed, I make sure all the doors and windows are locked. And when I take Rusty out, we stay close to the house, where the light from the porch keeps the shadows away. Because even though I don't know what's out there, I know one thing for sure. The forest is watching, and it doesn't want to be disturbed. When I was 14, I worked at a small booth in the local mall. My name is Lucas, and I had just started my first real job. The booth was for a cell phone company, and I mostly spent my time sitting there waiting for customers to come by. The mall was pretty busy, and there were always people walking by, but most of them weren't interested in talking to me. I didn't mind, though. I liked people watching, and it gave me a chance to pass the time. I was working an evening shift that day, from 4 p.m. until the mall closed at 9. It was always busy at first, with lots of people shopping, but things started to quiet down after dinner time. By 8:30, most of the stores were closing, and the mall started to empty out. I was finishing up my shift, just doing some last-minute cleaning at my booth, when I noticed a man walking by. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was a tall guy, probably in his late 30s or early 40s, with short, dark hair and wearing a gray jacket. He seemed like any other shopper. But then, something strange happened. About 10 minutes later, I saw him walking by again. He wasn't carrying any bags, and he wasn't stopping to look at anything. He just walked past me, staring straight ahead. It was a little odd, but I didn't think it was anything to worry about. I just shrugged it off and went back to my phone. But then about 20 minutes later, I saw him again. This time he stopped and looked at the phones on display in my booth. He didn't ask any questions, just stared at them for a while. I gave him a polite nod, but he didn't say anything. After a few moments, he kept walking, disappearing into the crowd. I thought that was the last I'd see of him, but when I checked the time, it was almost 9. The mall was nearly empty. I was getting ready to close up when I saw the man again. He was walking in the same direction as before, but this time he looked right at me. It was a quick glance, but there was something strange about the way he looked at me, almost like he knew something I didn't. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried not to think about it. Maybe he was just another late-night mall walker. Still, I kept seeing him walking by, over and over. It was almost like he was pacing the same area, never stopping for long. When the clock struck 9, I packed up my things and started walking toward the exit. I was just thinking about getting to my car and going home. But as I walked through the mall's main corridor, I saw him again. This time, he was standing near the entrance, just staring at the exit doors. I hurried past, trying not to make eye contact, and stepped outside into the cool night air. I wasn't too worried at first. After all, he was just another mall goer, right? But then, as I walked toward the parking lot, I started to hear footsteps behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. I told myself I was just imagining things. It wasn't until I reached my car that I started to feel uneasy. As I was about to open the door, I looked around one last time. And there he was, the same man. He was standing at the edge of the parking lot, looking at me. But this time, he didn't walk away. He just stood there, watching me. My heart raced as I quickly got into my car and locked the door. I didn't know what to do. Why was he following me? Had he been following me the entire time? I wasn't sure, but one thing was for certain. I needed to get out of there. I drove home as quickly as I could, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When I got home, I parked my car and hurried up to my apartment. I lived on the second floor of a small building, and the only way in was through the main entrance. I thought I was safe. But as I walked down the hallway to my apartment, I heard footsteps again. This time, they were much closer, as though someone was walking just behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. I paused for a moment, feeling like someone was watching me. That's when I heard the footsteps again. I froze. The man from the mall was now standing at the end of the hallway, staring at me with that same unsettling expression. I didn't know how he had followed me here, but I was scared. I ran to my door and locked it behind me, pressing my back against it. I tried to stay calm. I turned on the TV to drown out the noise, but my mind was racing. Who was this man? How had he found me? And why was he following me? It wasn't long before I heard footsteps again. This time, they were outside my apartment door. I peeked through the peephole, and there he was, standing just outside, staring at my door. I didn't know what to do. I had to get away. I grabbed my phone and called my best friend Noah. He lived just down the street, and I needed someone to talk to. I told him what was happening, and he said he would come over. I felt a little better knowing he was on his way. But then, the footsteps stopped. I listened carefully, but there was no sound. The man was gone. Noah showed up shortly afterward, and we went over everything. I told him about how I had seen the man at the mall, following me, and how I was sure he had come to my apartment. We stayed up late that night, talking and watching TV, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe. The next day, I went back to the mall, hoping to see the man again and get some answers. But when I got there, I didn't see him anywhere. I asked around, but no one had seen him. It was like he had disappeared. I never saw the man again, and to this day, I don't know what to make of it. Was he just a strange coincidence, or did he really follow me home? I don't know. But I do know one thing. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, and the strange man who seemed to be everywhere I went. And that's why I always tell people, sometimes the things we see in the mall aren't always what they seem.